Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. Today we will see what if Naruto Hellsing. If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. It started out like it had for the past few years. Naruto would wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat on the verge of tears after yet another nightmare. He'd spend the rest of the night trying to calm himself down, boshily twitching at almost every sound he'd hear. When 8 a.m. rolled around he'd quickly put on his mask of idiocy and await the Hokage, whom he often called Gigi. The Hokage would take Naruto for ramen and spend a few hours chatting with the boy before parting ways with him around midday. Naruto would then go off to some secluded training ground or back to his rundown apartment and study for the academy. He needed to use almost all his spare time just to get himself a barely passing grade due to everything being rigged. When the sun started to set and the festival started, he'd quickly leave his house trying to avoid too much damage being done to it. He'd then simply wait. He'd long since given up trying to hide. The ninja with the weird eyes could always find him. Just because he didn't bother hiding didn't mean he'd lay down and take it. "There's the demon. Get him," was the call of a large, burly-looking man. Naruto quickly turned tail and started sprinting through the streets. He'd never agreed with the whole hiding in the shadows. It seemed cowardly to him. He'd rather beat his opponent with his own strength against theirs. It was a sort of honor to him in this world where children killed for money because they were told to and think nothing of it. "Get after him," another person cried as they watched the boy disappear into an alleyway. Naruto was never a very strong boy, but what he lacked in strength he made up for in agility and flexibility. He easily used that to his advantage, basically jumping obstacles and such to try and increase the gap. Sparring a glance over his shoulder, Naruto noticed that currently there were no ninja in the mob, which meant he wouldn't have to worry about them for about 15 minutes before the news of the fox hunt spread about the village like wildfire. After turning back to look in front of him, Naruto had to duck under a swing from a villager who'd ran around to cut him off. "Thank Kami I'm short for my age," Naruto thought. Naruto was very short for his age. He was 12 years old and still only stood about 4 feet 2 with a rather lean build. He was often unable to find decent food and thus it stunted his growth quite severely. After ducking the swing and realizing he just ran straight into the middle of the main street of Konoha where most of the festival goers would be, he froze for an instant until he heard the shouts of the mob behind him. "Get back here, Kyuubi brat," one of them called. Soon several people from the main street looked to see what was going on and found Naruto looking like a deer caught in the headlights before he quickly dashed off. He looked back again to see the group chasing him had at least tripled in size and a few were brandishing weapons such as planks, pipes, knives and anything else they could get their hands on. Then he spotted the ninja on the rooftops. It was almost like it was all organized. The ninja would stick to the roofs of the buildings to get a bird's eye look on the boy, making escape harder, while the larger body of the civilians could kept him moving, so he tired out and couldn't turn back. Whenever he tried to go towards the Hokage tower, ninja would jump down and bar his passage. It was almost like they were animals simply toying with their prey. Naruto soon decided he needed to try getting past one of the ninja before they lead him to some dead-end alley. He saw a turn coming up ahead and made a decision. When he saw one of the younger-looking ninja drop down with a kunai in hand who was trying to look threatening, Naruto rushed him, which surprised the boy. Naruto's shoulder barged the genin, but as he did, the genin jammed the kunai into his shoulder joint, eliciting a scream from Naruto, who quickly applied pressure without removing the obtrusion. 1. After another 15 minutes of being chased through Konoha and only receiving a few more injuries in the form of cuts and blunt objects being thrown at him, Naruto ran straight through an old-looking pair of metal gates with a strange crest with a swirl in 2 of the corners and a rook in the bottom right. The courtyard leading up to the large run-down mansion seemed completely devoid of life, as gnarled trees, dead grass and weeds seemed to be all that remained of a once beautiful garden. Without even thinking, he quickly burst through the large double doors while thanking whichever god was watching over him and fighting his usually horrible luck. He ducked inside and closed the door quickly, running down a hallway just as the door was kicked open roughly by one of the ninja with a greatly chakra-enhanced kick. Due to there being Hyuga in the crowd, they quickly gave chase once more. They caught up to Naruto in a long hallway with a door at the end. Without a second thought, Naruto made a mad dash for the other end and threw the door open to see a long set of stairs leading down into the darkness. In an instant, Naruto suffered a faint spell due to the blood loss from the blade still sticking out of his shoulder. He fell straight down the long set of stairs, managing to land himself a few broken bones in the process as well as getting all the air knocked from his lungs. "Huh, he ran downstairs. We've got him no. You two stay up here and make sure he doesn't get out. We'll go down," shouted one of the Chunin at a pair of genin. After hearing this, the blood-covered blonde started trying to drag himself across the room, leaving a smeared bloody trail from the blood on his clothing. Once he got as far as he could, which consisted of a sort of cell with the remains of a woman in it, he turned around to see the group slowly and deliberately closing in on him. There were about 4 Chunin, 3 genin and a large group of civilians. Naruto flipped himself onto his back and looked up at the man in charge with clear hatred in his eyes. He just hoped the man would drop dead. Well, what have we here? A little fox trapped in a dark dungeon. He sneered out. You killed so many people close to us. You murders friends, family, lovers, even children. He shouted as he drove the kunai further in with his heel until the blade protruded from the other side, letting a bloody glob splatter the ground behind him as well as the corpse. Naruto let loose a screech of pain that could wake the dead as the man continued to assault his already mutilated shoulder with his foot. I bet it hurts, huh, demon? Trust me, it doesn't hurt nearly as much as you hurt so many people when you attacked us. He continued to taunt the injured boy about something he didn't understand. The group he was with were all brandishing their weapons or fists, just waiting for their turn to get revenge. Well, I say we get a little revenge before finally finishing the fourth's work and correcting the mistakes of the third. Don't die too quickly, Kyuubi. And with that, the man went to drive the kunai he was holding into Naruto's stomach. ****. The man froze with the kunai inches from Naruto, who just sat there with his eyes screwed shut. The noise came again and they noticed it was coming from behind Naruto. Slowly the Chunin looked up and behind the boy. So caught up in their revenge, they'd completely forgotten about a corpse in the room. Only, the corpse was now bent over on its knees with its tongue slowly and delicately lapping at the blood pooling beneath Naruto. What the fuck? Was all the head Chunin managed to stutter out as he was stunned and slightly horrified by the sight. The corpse's brittle-looking body started to regain some structure to it as it continued to lap at the blood now directly from the source, though it seemed to be extremely careful not to cause Naruto any pain. If anything, Naruto noticed it seemed to dull the pain in his shoulder. Finally, the figure seemed to have had its fill and slowly rose from its kneeling position to stand an impressive 6'1" behind Naruto. She had a rather lean, athletic build with generous assets and several mouth-watering curves. Her bust would easily be around an E-cup. She wore what looked like a leather straitjacket which currently had no straps on the sleeves, allowing her full control over the limbs, alongside a pair of long black pants and black boots. Her long inky hair cascaded down her back to just above her butt and was rather the contrast to her ghostly pale skin. Her eyes were a strange mix of crimson and orange, with a very small pupil sitting in the dead center that seemed to grow into almost non-existence as the eyes seemed to ripple outwards. The recently deceased took one look down at Naruto, who looked just as shocked as the crowd as seeing a dead woman lick up his blood and come back to life before their very eyes. Though for some reason he lacked the fear they felt. It was like he knew she wouldn't hurt him. The woman looked away from Naruto and seemed very displeased about something as she glared at the crowd, sending out a literal tidal wave of ki. The crowd were frozen in fear as the women started a slow approach to the first man. I spend what I can tell has been several thousand years in a death-like state, and the first thing I wake to in my new master, who can't be any older than 12, being tortured by a group of adults. She spoke in an angelic, yes somehow furious voice that conveyed just how angry she was. The 4 Chunin had experience with ki and quickly snapped out of it. So you're going to try and protect the demon? Fine. Kill the bitch, he shouted as he ran at her, kunai in hand. The moment he was in arm's reach, there was an enormous spurt of blood as his outstretched arm was ripped from its socket and an arm went straight through his torso. He slowly looked down wide-eyed as the woman removed her arm from him and licked the blood only to spit it back out. Tastes terrible after that of my master, she said as the man fell to the ground, the light now gone from his eyes and his face forever etched into one of pure agony and terror. This sight once more stopped the group in their tracks as they also were wide-eyed. Who are you? One of them asked as he shook all over. A sadistic grin slowly split the face of the new demon before them. I've been called many things. Dracula, Nosferatu, Night Walker, Vampire, Queen of the Night. She listed, in a breath. To my master I am a humble servant waiting for his orders, and to you. She paused while her grin stretched further. I'm a nightmare, she said darkly. However, my true name is Morgana Tepps. And with that she rushed through the crowd, severing limbs, breaking bones and crushing skulls with her white-gloved hands, yet somehow keeping them perfectly clean. When she finished with those who were also in the dungeon, she turned to Naruto with her grin going from a sadistic, malicious one to a gentle, caring one. She approached Naruto and was happy to see the boy no shying away, though he looked slightly worried about her approach. Relax, young master, I would never dare of thinking about hurting you. For now sleep, rest. Or I must clean up the trash that now loiters about the halls of this place. And know that when you awake all will be explained, she said with her voice sounding like velvet. Naruto decided to trust the strange feeling inside and let himself be dragged into the sweet embrace of unconsciousness as his head fell towards the cold hard ground. Morgana caught him and quickly disappeared into the shadows and stepped out into a large bedroom with a comfortable-looking bed. After removing his bloodied clothes and dressing his wound, which she noticed was already healing, the Dark Queen then swept through the halls like a vengeful spirit, seeking out all who sought to bring her new master harm as she painted the halls red. Before beginning the long process of cleaning up the grounds and building XXXXXXXXX, Naruto slowly felt himself coming back to the world of the conscious. He slowly opened his eyes and scanned the unfamiliar surroundings. When his mind finally kick-started, the memories of the night prior finally hit him full force and he sat up with tremendous speed. The first thing he noticed was his lack of attire, being in only his boxer shorts. The second was the dull sunlight coming from the curtains, signifying the sun was sinking again. I slept through the whole night and day? He thought. The third was the bloodied bandages that were over where he remembered the kunai being forced into his body. He could feel the wound had healed, but there was still phantom pains. It was odd, normally a wound of that size and depth would take even him at least half a week to fully close. Excellent, you're awake, came a familiar voice from where Naruto remembered seeing the large double doors. Naruto's head snapped towards the voice so quickly he wasn't sure he didn't just kill himself. As standing in the doorway was the woman, Morgana from last night, now dressed in what looked like a large dark red bordering black coat that split into two tails near the bottom. A dress shirt that seemed slightly strained against her bust, long black pants that accentuated her long legs, and dress shoes. She also had a pair of glasses sticking out of the breast pocket of the coat. Naruto absently noted she was quite beautiful in his opinion. Sakura had absolutely nothing on this woman before him. Morgana had caught him eyeing the now healed wound and thought she'd answer his unspoken question. Vampire saliva has surprisingly powerful healing properties if we so wish it, she explained with a grin that seemed almost ever present on her face. Naruto gained a confused look on his face before realizing what she meant. Then the severity of that statement hit him full force. So all those things you said last night were true? He asked with just a small hint of worry. Morgana nodded in answer. And all those people, you really killed them? He questioned, finding it odd how he felt no sorrow or sympathy for them. Once more Morgana nodded her head. They were trying to hurt my new master. I couldn't let them get away with such actions, she explained. Naruto once more grew confused. Master? He asked again. Morgana's grin grew at the question as she got up from her position leaning against the doorframe and approached Naruto, who still sat in the bed. When they hurt you and spilled your blood on me, I was awoken from a deep sleep I was put into. I could smell and taste in the blood that you are a descendant of the Hellsing family, as only one with a high enough concentration of their blood could wake me from my sleep. Since it was your blood that awoke me, I am your loyal servant. Now and forever. And on my honor as a Draculina, I will do everything in my power to fulfill any and all assignments you give me, my master. She finished, now on one knee with her head bowed and her hand over her still heart. Naruto felt his face go slightly red at this and quickly suppressed it. I don't really know what to say. I guess I have no choice, OT, except. I wouldn't want to force you back into that cell, huh? Naruto said with a smile as he scratched the back of his head, seemingly already over the previous night's events. After 8 years of it, he lost most of his innocence to the cruelty of the villagers. Morgana smiled another kind smile as she looked up at her new master. He seemed to accept her despite the little display she put on last night in her rage. She couldn't help how handsome he looked when he smiled as well. He'll be quite the looker in a few years, she thought. She was also pleased that he wouldn't wish her back to the cell and by extension into that horrible death-like state. Naruto grew somber again. I should probably go tell Gigi that I'm okay, Naruto thought out loud. Morgana looked at Naruto. You mean the Hokage? She asked. Naruto smiled again. Yeah, but I call him Gigi because he's one of my precious people. How did you know? He replied. Then I'll go with you to meet this precious person of yours, and I knew because when I drank your blood I gained your knowledge both conscious and subconscious of the current world. Morgana explained. Again Naruto experienced that strange feeling like this should worry him or put him off, but he just couldn't seem to grasp the feeling, so, shrugging it off, he started to get out of the bed only to feel phantom pains in his shoulder. I think I might need a new set of bindings. The skin feels sensitive. He winced with a pained grin. Naruto then looked down to notice his state of undress. And maybe some new clothes. I remember mine being a bit ruined, he said with a smile. Morgana smiled at this. I can get you some clothes from your old apartment for you and I'll rewrap the bindings for you, she said with a smile and quickly left and returned with a roll of bandages. Naruto gained a thoughtful look as he enjoyed the feeling of Morgana's gentle touch as she removed his bloodied bandages. How do you know where my apartment is? And what do you mean old? These questions seemed like the most prominent. Like I said, I gained all your knowledge of the world, including the layout of the village to a degree and where your old apartment is. As for it being your old apartment, you'll be staying here from now on, she said absently as she worked not to agitate the pinkish flesh of the recently closed wound. Naruto opened his mouth to ask something, but Morgana seemed to pick up on his question. As the new head of Hellsing family, the grounds of this manor and everything that resides in and on them is now yours. Therefore you'll be staying here instead of that ratty apartment, she said as she finished her work. I'll be bringing all your things from the apartment later after we've met with this Hokage. Now Morgana stood up. Wait here a moment, was all Naruto got before he watched his new servant walk into the corner of the room, and more specifically a shadow, and seemingly phase out of existence into the corner. A few moments passed and Naruto spent MSOT of it staring at the corner before getting over his shock. It wasn't all that weird. He'd once seen a person control his shadow like some sort of bindings. I wonder if Morgana could help me with training. I'm not very good at ninjutsu and I don't think I could be as good as that Lee guy from a few years ahead in taijutsu, Naruto thought absently. His musings were cut short by a familiar voice. I went to your apartment and I'm sorry to say that the whole building was burnt down, Morgana said with a slight tinge of sadness for her master losing all his possessions. Naruto seemed a little sad for a moment as they looked at the bed below him before he put on a fake smile. At least no one wanted to live there, so no one was hurt, he said with his eyes closed to hide them and his true feelings. That was the one place his mask always failed. Morgana found the fake smile Naruto put on to try and seem strong rather unsightly. I'll have to fix that later, she thought. I'll go find you some clothes for now until we can get you something more permanent, Morgana said and dissipated out the door this time. Naruto let the smile drop from his face and drew his knees to his head and hugged them as tears escaped his eyes. The few things Naruto had ever been given had been in that apartment. It hurt to know that it was all gone. He wasn't sure how long he sat there and let a small amount of his true feelings out before a pair of arms encircled him. Naruto's head shot up immediately to see the kind smile of Morgana. It's okay, young master. Let it out, she said as she hugged him close. That was all Naruto needed as he let out 8 years of pain. He sat there for at least an hour just crying into this woman's arms. He'd barely met her a day ago and he'd been asleep for most of it, and the first thing he saw her do was commit mass murder. Yet he felt safer with her than he'd ever felt in his entire life. After he finished, Naruto wiped his eyes and smiled a much more genuine smile which got a small fluttering in Morgana as a reaction. She in turn let a small, kind smile play across her face. Now that you're feeling better, I found some temporary clothing so we can go speak to this Hokage of yours, Morgana said, getting up and grabbing the nearby clothing. Naruto nodded and quickly got dressed into a pair of black shorts, a slightly too large long-sleeve shirt with the sleeves covering his hands and hanging over them, and a pair of socks and shoes Naruto was unfamiliar with. It's a bit big, Naruto said as he gave up trying to get the sleeves to stay up and just let them hang. Morgana laughed a little at this. To Naruto it was a wholly pleasant sound. Like I said, you're not stuck in them forever. Anyway, we should get going. The sooner we get this done the better. And with that the pair set off through the manor with Morgana in the lead and Naruto casually looking around at what was now his. During his first time going around he was in a bit of a hurry. But now that it was a sedated pace with no one chasing him, he really got to take in the surroundings. The walls seemed to all be white with paintings and other pieces along the walls. The skirts were made decorated with gold and occasionally the wall would jut out in a sort of ornate pillar. This place looks better than Gigi's house, Naruto thought as he remembered the building from the few times he'd gone there with the old man. When they got out the front, Naruto noticed it was much more alive than when he'd gone through it yesterday. Deciding to ask about it later, the young blonde continued his walk towards the Hokage's tower. During the trip, Naruto caught several comments from civilians as well as a few harsh glares. Look, the demon's still alive. Why is that thing still here? Who's that woman with him? She's pretty hot. These kinds of comments seemed to be a recurring theme as the duo walked the streets of Konoha on their way to the Hokage tower. Naruto just ignored the catcalls directed towards Morgana and insults flung at him by civilians. Naruto may have been able to ignore it, but Morgana was having a pretty hard time not turning the cretins into messy, red stains on the road for insulting her master and saying such vulgar things towards her. None of you filthy beasts are worthy. She though but corrected herself after a glance at her master. Well, there is one I'd happily let, she thought with a smirk. Morgana was suddenly pulled from her thoughts by the cry of her master, the scent of his divine blood and the loud laughter of the surrounding villagers. Nice shot, Tenichi. You got that demon good, a random civilian called out. Morgana looked to see her master kneeling on the ground holding her face with blood seeping from between his fingers and a bloody brick on the road next to him. That's it, she muttered darkly and clenched her fists tightly. Morgana spun towards where the person called out and saw a group of boys who looked a good 6 years older than her master. She approached the group, now exuding ki in waves as she approached them with murder at the front of her mind. Standing over the group, she was a good foot taller than most of them. Which one of you threw that brick? She snarled with her pointed teeth clenched in anger. Out of simple fear the group pointed at one boy who now looked at his traitorous friend before looking back to the women. Deciding to act brave, he spoke. Yeah, I threw it. So what? He's just a no-good demon and a murderer. He doesn't deserve to live. Who the hell are you anyway, huh? He asked with his arrogance seemingly diverting the key. Morgana grinned sadistically at that. I'm the person who makes sure my master doesn't want for anything. I make sure he's happy no matter what. And now he's in pain. So I need to stop that pain by removing the cause. She then pointed at the boy with her index finger extended. And that would be you. The moment she spoke that last word, she prodded the boy in the chest and he suddenly exploded into spray of blood that hit the nearby wall to form a crimson cross. Nothing remained of the boy except that marker. It took a few moments for the events to register or the onlookers past the fear. But when it did, there was an uproar as people screamed and fled the immediate area with screams of another demon protecting the fox child. Morgana ignored all this in favor of going to her still-downed master and slowly pulling his hands away from his face. There was a large deep gash across his forehead and over his left eye. Don't worry, I'll MKE it all better, she soothed as she licked the wound, covering it in her healing saliva. Naruto sighed as he felt the pain numb much like the wound on his shoulder did the night before. With a hiss, the wound seemed to start sizzling shut. Though still not very fast, the wound would be done by the hour. Though there would be a scar like with his shoulder. Then a group of people appeared in front of them via Shunshin. Naruto Uzumaki, the Hokage has asked up to escort you and your acquaintance to his office, said a cat-masked Anbu Naruto recognized as Neko. Naruto didn't really like any of the Anbu as they never really stopped him getting hurt. Okay, I guess, he said hesitantly. Morgana picked up on her master's hostility and glared at the masked people, but otherwise let them shunshin herself and her master to the Hokage's office. The moment they appeared in the Hokage's office, he dismissed them with silent signal. When the Anbu were gone, Hiruzen let his features soften into a sad look when his eyes fell on the no longer bleeding but still present gash in his forehead. Hello Naruto. I'd ask how you are, but that's pretty obvious. Would you like to tell me who your friend is and how you met her? Hiruzen queried, still weary of the stranger who seemed rather close to the boy he saw as an adopted grandson. Naruto thought about it a moment and grew a sad look on my face. He then recounted the events of the day before after he and Sarutobi parted ways around midday, not skipping any details, as Sarutobi had probably saw Morgana kill that guy outside with his crystal ball Naruto sometimes saw him use. Though he painted it all in an image where he was the victim. Which he wasn't aware was completely true. He'd always assumed it was because of his pranks he used as a way to get attention. I'll have to keep an eye on this woman. If what Naruto said is true, she's dangerous, she thought as he lit his pipe. He also absently noted the gash had scarred up over the hours they'd be talking. Well, I guess I don't really have any choice in the matter as it's already decided. I'll have to call a council meeting about this and you will both need to be present, but that can wait until tomorrow. I'll send someone around to retrieve you. You may go, Hiruzen said as he started attacking his paperwork. At least now I won't need to send Anbu to watch over the boy. Were Hiruzen's last thoughts before mentally abusing his paperwork, as it seemed to breed like rabbits. Naruto went to sleep shortly after, with Morgana once more tending, making sure everything was right amongst the grounds before finally settling down on a chair in the corner of Naruto's room. "Good night, my young master," she thought as Naruto drifted off to sleep. Naruto thrashed about in his sleep. Strange lifelike images flashing through his dreams. He saw flashes of a woman with fiery red hair. A teen girl with long auburn hair. He could see himself being chased by villagers. Anbu with blank masks. Scenes of horrible torture passed before his eyes. The target, himself. The nightmare felt like it continued for eternity until Naruto finally woke and sat bolt upright in the bed, screaming. Whole body shaking, drenched in sweat. He could feel tears on his eyes. A nearby clock said it was around 4 in the morning. I've been asleep for 4 hours. Great. Naruto then looked around his surroundings to find the same bedroom he'd been in yesterday. But where's Morgana? He thought to himself. Then he realized the slender arms wrapped around his waist. He slowly turned to see the woman wearing a rather revealing nightgown that showed off her creamy white skin and a rather large portion of cleavage. Blushing, Naruto quickly looked away only to lock eyes with Morgana, who he realized wasn't asleep. Quickly trying to suppress his blush, he asked, "Why are you in the bed with me?" It was difficult not to look at her more inviting assests. A knowing grin spread across her face as she caught Naruto looking at her. Though the raven-haired woman noticed it was less lustful and more appreciation, like you would a piece of fine art. Deciding to not tease the boy because of the unintentional compliment, she said nothing on the matter. It helped that she wore such revealing clothing to that end. "You were crying out in your sleep, so I tried to comfort you. It seemed to work because you calmed down slightly," she said as she slowly and reluctantly released her grip around the boy only to be hugged. "Thank you," was all Naruto said as a few more tears escaped him. Naruto wouldn't normally cry this much, but he felt like he could let it out around the Draculina. He felt comfortable. "It's alright," was her reply as she gently hugged her master back. They got up soon after, with Naruto once more wearing his clothing from his meeting with his grandfather figure, as they'd yet to buy him some new clothing. Morgana directed Naruto to a large dining room attached to a larger kitchen which the night mistress disappeared into. Naruto took a seat and quietly waited, wondering what she was doing. A few minutes later she returned with food for Naruto and placed it in front of him before taking a nearby seat. The blonde thanked the ravenet before forking the simple meal. "Wow, this is really good, Morgana," he said after swallowing as not to talk with his mouth full. He remembered Gigi beating that lesson into him. Morgana smiled at yet another compliment. It had been a while since she had such an openly kind master. "Glad you like it," she replied with a grin. Something quickly dawned on Naruto. "Hey, I have a question," he said. Morgana silently prompted him to ask away. "You're a vampire, right? Don't you need to drink blood or something?" he said with another fork full of egg going into his mouth. The vampiress looked rather amused by that fact. "You're correct. I do need blood. I can drink any blood, however, as you are now my master, yours would be the best. Both for sustaining me and it tastes better than any I've ever had." Morgana seemed to get a sort of dreamy look to her eyes as she remembered the first taste. "Oh, well, I guess it would be wrong of me as a master to not take care of you." With that, Naruto started undoing the buttons on his shirt. "Come on then, we've got a lot to do today," the blonde said while grinning. The Draculina was slightly surprised by her master's willingness to give his blood to freely. In the past the masters would offer her donated and old or frozen blood that didn't taste nearly as good or was anywhere close to as refreshing. You truly are different. With that thought the ravenet leant forwards while Naruto tried to look away from the cleavage on display. He winced slightly when the fangs pierced his neck but otherwise didn't protest. When she was done, Morgana licked the preteen's neck overly sensually and let the small bite marks heal. Naruto shivered and quickly went back to his meal and trying to fight down a blush. When the pair finished their meals it was Morgana who spoke up first. I think it would be a good idea to go get you some new clothing. I'm sure we can get the Hokage to exchange the outdated currency for the more common one. She mused out loud. This got Naruto's agreement as he had been wanting some new clothes for a while now. Soon after the two set off towards the Hokage tower again, though this time Morgana used something she called a shadow step, that Naruto noticed was similar to the shunshin he saw Shinobi doing. After Morgana had given the Hokage the details of the Hellsing accounts and him working out the conversions as well as almost having a heart attack at the amount of digits now in Naruto's grasp, the young master and the eternal servant were walking around Konoha with people now keeping their comments quiet after the stories of the demon's bodyguard killing someone with one hit had spread. Which was actually an understatement. She'd actually made him explode with a prod. Before they'd left the Hokage tower, Hiruzen had suggested they go to a certain ninja supply store as he was pretty sure the owner had nothing against Naruto. He'd also given them directions. Naruto now stood in front of an ordinary-looking store. It had nothing outstanding about it except a small sign that said, "Wild Geese Munitions," in red paint. Naruto shrugged and walked inside. He wasn't one to judge a book by its cover as that's what people had done to him his whole life. The blonde quickly entered the building to find a rather impressive interior. It's nothing like it is on the outside. Naruto thought out loud. We don't want every villager walking in and throwing their money around to get a nice mantelpiece. Everything here was crafted to be used, said a deep voice from behind the boy as he had turned a full 180 to face the door again. The boy turned slowly and then looked up at the giant towering over him. Naruto just looked at the man as he inspected the boy. Naruto was just waiting for him to recognize him and throw him out. So he was shocked when the man put a hand on his shoulder and offered a small smile. "So what can I do y'all for, lad? I'm sure you didn't come into my unsuspecting store out of curiosity," he said with a gleam in his eye while turning and walking towards the counter with Naruto in tow. Once he reached the counter he looked to Naruto expectantly. "Well?" he questioned. Naruto smiled. "Right, Hokage Gigi said I could come here to talk to you about some new clothing and maybe some ninja equipment. I'll be taking the graduation exam soon at the academy," he said with a smile. The giant grinned. "Well, you came to the right place, lad. Got any idea what you're looking for?" he said with a raised eyebrow. Naruto was about to speak when Morgana beat him to it. "I had a few ideas I would like to suggest," she said while withdrawing a notepad from one of her pockets and handing it to He-Man. He flipped the pages a few times with his eyebrows raising slightly with each. "She's put a lot of thought into this for you, lad. Looks like your luck's changing for the better," he thought with a smile creeping across his lips. "I reckon I could have it done in a few hours. Take a look around the store. I've got the gear a fresh graduate would be looking for," he said as he walked through a door behind the counter and disappeared. Naruto raised an eyebrow at Morgana as he both hadn't known about her designing his clothing nor did he know when she had the time. He shrugged it off and decided he could ask later. He trusted her judgment and it's not like he really had any idea what he wanted. At that moment an Anbu slipped into the store. "Naruto Uzumaki, the Hokage has requested both your presence in the council chamber. Please come along." Again Naruto looked hesitant around the Anbu but let the man shunshin them to the outside of the chamber. "Wait here until you're called in." With that the Anbu left the two in the lobby. 15 minutes later, Naruto sat on a chair looking rather agitated with the dark rings around his eyes only adding to the effect. The only thing stopping the boy from snapping was the ever so slight humming of his taller acquaintance whom had her arm around the boy's shoulders holding him in a one-armed hug while in her other was a wicked-looking knife she seemed rather comfortable holding. The doors opened and an Anbu stepped out. "The council will see you now," was all that was said before he disappeared into the room. Naruto seemed to grow angrier at that. The boy slipped out of his servant's grasp and started for the door. Morgana herself simply smiled at her master and followed him in soon after. I smile so much around this one. He's different. What is that boy doing in the council chamber? Screamed a pink-haired councilwoman. Most of the shinobi winced and Hiruzen simply glared at her. Naruto and his companion are here as recent events would demand such. Naruto, if you would, the aged Kage said with a hand gesture. Naruto nodded and retold the events of the past few days, leaving out anything he decided certain parties didn't need to know or things he saw as trivial. And that's about it. I'm now the heir of the Hellsing family. I don't really know too much about what that entails, so I'll let Morgana tell you, I guess. He said, stepping back, and only now did the people notice the rather tall and attractive women standing behind the boy in the shadows. The Ravenette had a large and slightly frightening grin on her face as she wanted to scare these council members who caused her master so much trouble. Her crimson, orange eyes were scanning across the room as the top half of her face was shadowed by the brim of her hat. First, as Naruto said, my name is Morgana Tepps. I am a faithful servant of the Hellsing family, which consists of my current master. I serve him and no one else. This got a few sour looks from certain council members. The Hellsing family has always been a very prestigious family. They have been many things throughout time. Guardians of the blind world, mercenaries, revolutionaries. These are only a few of many things this family has done. And there are two things a person must know about someone of Hellsing blood. They never break a promise. And they never give up. Hiruzen smiled at this because Naruto fit that small description perfectly. However, it falls completely to my master to make the decision about what he will do with it. With that, she gave a small gesture to open the floor to questions. How could that boy be head of anything? I say we strip him of the title and give it to someone more worthy, said a rather rotund civilian. Naruto grew angry at that and his hands were clenched into fists to heart, his knuckles were going white. Shut up. It was barely a whisper. He was at the very edge of the cliff, and one more comment from these bastards would just push him over. Another counselor looked at Naruto after hearing his comment. What was that, brat? How about you speak up so everyone can hear what you said? I'm sure they'll be thrilled to listen to a demagogue. Eyes bulged from heads at what people were seeing. Naruto had leapt the table to the counselor and wrapped his hands around his throat. Naruto was naturally stronger, being a genin hopeful, and thus the man couldn't pry him off. I said shut up. Naruto was now screaming. I'm so sick and goddamn tired of you people acting like I'm something I'm not. You treat me like dirt for something out of my control. It wasn't my fault. The enraged blonde was dragged off the man by two Anbu as said man rubbed his sore throat, which was showing signs of bruising. Get that demon child out of here. He's clearly mad and needs to be executed, screamed the man rubbing his throat still. Shluck. Barely a second passed between the words leaving his lips and a wicked-looking knife being jammed into his neck by a furious-looking Morgana. Several gurgles escaped the man as blood poured from his now mangled throat. He weakly grasped as the offending object and the hand holding it to no avail. The furious Draculina removed the weapon from his throat before catching him and taking a large chunk out of what remained of his throat. One person threw up at the sight as the Ravenette seemingly drained the man of all liquid as he slowly shriveled into a withered husk. Still not as good as Master's, she absent-mindedly stated and licked the knife clean. As the room still seemed to be unable to quite process the act, Morgana decided to break the silence. A servant of the Hellsing family's first and possibly most important job is to protect their master. This man has insulted my master in front of me and openly demanded him harm after provoking him into an attack. I've simply done my job. The knife was then placed back inside her coat and she walked slowly back to Naruto. Sarutobi was slightly glad that this woman had protected Naruto like that. This man has broken a severe law in the insult, threatening of the head of a family and clan in Konoha. He also attempted to usurp my authority as the Hokage by ordering for the boy's execution. His sentence has been carried out under Konoha's clan law A. 234, which dictates that he is to be given to said clan or family for punishment as seen fit. Many went to protest, however he continued. There was also another law broken. I doubt I need to remind the council of which I speak. Many who went to protest quickly quieted down and the body was dragged from the chamber by the Anbu who'd held Naruto earlier. The fact the council was actually silent let a small smile play across his face. Now I have a question in regards to the Hellsing family. I understand that Morgana here serves the family. Are there any others in a CLR position? He asked, more curious about the boy's safety than anything. Naruto went to speak and say, no. However, Morgana placed her hand on his shoulder. Like myself, there are 8 others who serve our master directly. Though they are still in the manor. The Ravenet gave Naruto a look that said, I'll explain later. While Naruto was wide-eyed like most of the council. Though the council were wide-eyed at the idea of 7 more people as strong as this person had shown to be. Though it was only against civilians thus far. The Hokage smiled at the idea of having more people to care for his surrogate grandson. Well, I think that's all we need from you. I'll leave you two to the rest of your day and I hope to see you again soon, Naruto. He said with a wave. Shortly after, the council started discussing, arguing, over team placements despite the fact the civilians would technically have no say. The blonde Hellsing heir looked at a nearby clock and overall it had been close to 2 hours since they left the wild geese. He looked at Morgana. We should probably go check if my clothes are ready, huh? This received a nod and the two headed back towards the store. Stepping back into the store, Naruto went straight to the counter and tapped a small bell twice to get the attention of the owner. The large man walked out from the back room and greeted the two with a wave and a smile. Hey, you're just in time. I just finished up work on the order if you want to head back and try it on. He said while cleaning his hands and face with an already dirty-looking cloth which he stuffed into his apron. Naruto nodded and disappeared behind the counter and out to the back. The moment he was out of sight, the gentle giant's eyes locked onto Morgana. That boy's had it hard enough in his life. I'm not going to treat you like people have treated him. But I hear anything about you or any of your kind hurting him. Well, he pulled down his collar slightly to reveal a mark on his neck that marked him as a hunter, descendants of vampire hunters who branched out to encompass more of the supernatural or dangerous. This caught the vampiress's attention, but otherwise she just smiled. There's something you need to understand before we continue. I'd rather kill this entire miserable village than see my master shed even a single tear. The only thing saving this place is his attachments here. It's not even the bond between master and servant. Something draws me to want to protect him. At that moment, Naruto walked out of the back room. Gone were the 2 large shirt and pants, replaced by a black leather chest piece over his torso and a long crimson coat with a hood on the neck and a pair of coat tails starting from the waist and going to his ankles. It was closed over his chest by 4 straps. For pants, he wore a pair of long black pants that lacked the numerous pockets a normal shinobi would have. They were tucked into a pair of black leather riding boots also held tight by straps, and his waist was a black belt with a buckle that was made to look like the Hellsing family crest. Oddly, the pants looked like they were made to support a second absent belt, but Naruto decided to ask about it later. 2 black leather layered pauldrons sat on his shoulders, also having the Hellsing crest. They were layered 3 times. He also wore a pair of white gloves made of a soft material. Naruto stretched about to get a better look at himself and get a better feel for the obviously combat-suited gear. How does it look? He asked of the two. You look great, lad. Ready to get out there and show him who's boss. The store owner said with a cheesy grin that didn't quit his size and a thumbs up that reminded him of a certain green beast Naruto had the displeasure of encountering once. Hey, thanks. The crimson-clad blonde said with a slight twitch in his eyebrow at the memory. I've got to agree. You do look rather dashing and sophisticated while at the same time you are ready for a fight. I couldn't have done better myself. Morgana said and let out a small grin at her joke. Alright, so how much do I owe you for this, mister? Naruto's eyes grew slightly wide as he realized something. I haven't even asked your name. How rude of me, he said. The giant grinned again at this. Name's Heihachi, 1. Make sure to remember it if you need any specialty work done, and I can offer you a noticeable discount. As for that little number, I'm willing to save 30,000 Ryu, 2. And I'll send another set your way. Naruto nodded to Morgana, who took out a roll of money and sifted through for the correct amount. Alright Heihachi, we need to be off. Thanks again for the new clothes. Naruto said with one hand over his shoulder in a wave, and Morgana nodding to the man as they left. Heihachi crossed his arms and smirked to himself. Good luck, kid. With that he went back to work. On the way back to the Hellsing Manor, several looks were shot at the duo. Most in fear of Morgana and the rest in confusion about Naruto's attire or his attitude seeming somewhat happier and more laid back than his usually tense self. When they entered the door, something dawned on Naruto. "Hey Morgana, during the meeting you said there were other servants like you? I haven't seen anyone else. What did you mean by that?" "Well, as I said, there are a total of 9 permanent servants of the Hellsing family. Normally I'm the first to be awoken, and when I believe the current head is ready I awaken the rest, which would take roughly 12 hours. The Ravenette then started down the hall with Naruto shortly behind. "I guess it'll be a while before I'm ready, huh?" It was more a statement than a question. "Actually, I started the process last night shortly after you retired to bed. They should be waking up soon. We should go before they wake up." The two then walked through the house and ended up back in the dungeon. Once there, Morgana touched a strange symbol on the wall and X pushed a deep red energy into it. The wall then split apart to reveal a larger circular room with several white pods. "Though 3 are vampires like me, they aren't able to survive as long without blood. So we put them in stasis with nutrients. I'm quite envious, really." Naruto just looked at the pods. Each had a name on it. Naruto went through and read the names. Sarah's Victoria, Integra Hellsing, Alexis Anderson, Heinkel Wolf, Yumi, Yumiko Takagi, Katarina Schrödinger, Harriet Gunch, Rip Van Winkle. Next to each pod Naruto decided to call coffins sat a set of items he assumed belonged to each person. He recognized a few in the way of 2 rapiers next to the one that said Integra and a katana next to Yumi's, as well as bayonet blades next to Alexis. The rest were wholly foreign to him, though one looked similar to the rifles he'd heard were being made by a snow country with materials from Iron Country. The front of each coffin slowly moved away. Instantly Naruto realized a few things. First and foremost, they were all female. Second, they all had a sort of unearthly beauty about them. Third was the fact they all looked to have rather gorgeous figures with large busts. But the thing he noticed last was simply because he covered his eyes. They were all naked. Several yawns sounded as well as bones popping due to disuse. "Geez, how long were we in there?" sounded a voice from Naruto's let where he remembered the coffin of Katarina was. "Judging from what I've gathered, a very long time," Morgana responded from Naruto's side. I'm so damn tense I'm going to need a massage," responded Katarina. At this point Naruto had turned around and left the room and was sitting against a wall listening to the conversation. He was curious how they all spoke the same language as him but decided not to pry. The conversation was mostly about the era and way things were in this time, as well as Naruto himself. Eventually the group walked out of the coffin room with most taking glances at Naruto. "Thaga," he said, nothing, getting up and following behind. The party eventually stopped in a large room. The group stopped and turned to Naruto, who just stopped walking and locked eyes with each person. Morgana stepped forwards. "I believe introductions are in order." Naruto nodded and gave a small wave, and a large smile they all noticed didn't reach his eyes. "Naruto Uzumaki Hellsing, current head of the Hellsing family. Nice to meet you all." This got a few smiles and a bit of laughter from the group, though not at Naruto. They thought he was cute. The group went through introductions such as their names, previous affiliation, areas of expertise, and then some basic information to make the group more familiar. Naruto was surprised to find out Integra was a distant relative of his and that all of them had these amazing abilities. Like Sarah's, Rip, Morgana and Integra being vampires, or how Harriet was a werewolf. Heinkel and Yumi were regenerators and could basically heal from anything short of decapitation. Alexis had a body that could change completely into thorny vines, and Schrödinger, who preferred to be referred to by that name as Katarina, was just a formality for paperwork and such. Could literally exist anywhere indefinitely. So long as she could recognize the fact she existed, she would. This basically allowed for long-range teleportation to anywhere she's been, as well as basically immortality. At first he was tense being in a room with such people, but he quickly got over that, as he didn't want to do to them as people did to him. After the talk, it was decided Naruto would be trained by them in several styles of fighting. He mentioned jutsu and chakra, and how the Hokage said Naruto would have trouble with them as his chakra was inhumanly dense and his reserves were bordering it as well. This descripting allowed the group to realize chakra was a watered-down version of the old mana. However, the Hellsing blood in Naruto seemed to purify it. This helped deciding if they should try teaching him magic. Alright, now that all of that is out of the way, we've got a head to train. Let's go. Morgana then headed toward the back of the manor, followed by the group and the Hellsing head. And with that, the blonde boy took his first steps towards what he'd one day become. Light slowly filtered into the room as the sun started to rise in the morning. Dew sat upon the glass that made up a large portion of the back office. The two side walls were large bookshelves filled with books of different colors, shapes and sizes. In front of the glass wall was a wooden desk that Naruto sat at in the early morning light, reading from a small plain-looking book. A week had passed since he'd started training with the rest of the Hellsing servants, and he'd made decent progress. They'd focused on fields that would help him to pass the exam, such as hand-to-hand combat, thrown projectiles, general knowledge, as well as more specific things related to the village history. He'd also started to learn to manipulate mana as to try and recreate the 3 basic academy jutsu using the denser substance, as well as taking up swordplay at the request of Integra. It hadn't taken much to convince the young master, and he could now preform basic forms with a blade. After a few more quiet moments sitting in the office, Naruto decided he'd head out to see if he could get something to eat. Standing up, it was instantly noticeable that he was taller. He at first was frightened by the growth spurt until Morgana had explained that it was part foe, the healing properties of vampire saliva. He was only short due to malnutrition, and as such, since he was eating well, so now the healing was fixing his body. He stood decent 5 feet 4 now, which was noticeably taller than his classmates. He was quite shocked to see his clothing grew with him, so he still wore the clothes he'd had made a week ago. Naruto closed his book and stashed it in a pocket inside his coat and headed out of his office and down a hall. The place was a literal maze, however he'd finally figured out the twists and turns to the place, so after a few minutes of walking he now stood in the kitchen. He quickly moved to the fridge and removed a bowl of some of the leftovers from the night before and pulled out his book while waiting for it to heat up. Literally the second the book was in his hand, he put it away again and jumped 3 feet in the air as Schrödinger had just popped into existence right next to him with a loud, "Hiya." He still wasn't used to that. He could deal with others walking out of shadows, but Shro just appeared from nowhere. There was absolutely no warning. "Good morning, Shro," Naruto said while settling his heart. The cat-eared girl grinned at her little prank. "Whatcha doin', Tilda?" she said in a slightly sing-song voice. Naruto, now settled, scratched the taller girl's ears. He'd found out they were rather sensitive and that she enjoyed it. "Just grabbing something to eat before I head to the academy today," was his reply. "Oh, that's right, you've got that exam today. Can I come watch?" she asked, giving what she decided was her kitty eyes, as she wasn't too fond of calling them the puppy dog eyes. The crimson-clad blonde grinned while looking at her. She didn't need to use the eyes, it's not like he'd say no. "If you want. I'll have to speak to Iruka, my teacher, but I'm sure family are allowed to watch, and as far as I'm concerned, you guys are my family," he finished with a smile. "Couldn't have said it better myself." Came a more regal-sounding two looked toward the source of the voice and found a darker-skinned woman with bleached blonde hair. Integra Fairbrook Winget's Hellsing, an ex-head of the Hellsing family and now a Draculina. Also Naruto's oldest, living, relative. "Morning, Integra," Naruto said politely. "Come for your morning coffee?" he asked, though after a week he was starting to pick up on patterns and habits of the residents of the Hellsing Manor. "Yes, I am. You should know by now that I cannot function in society without a cup of coffee." As this was said, she took a sip from the cup she just filled, followed by a satisfied sigh. "Anyway, don't you have somewhere to be this morning?" the ex-Hellsing head said while leaning on the counter and drinking her coffee. Naruto grinned wider. "Yeah, just came to grab some food before I left. Also, can you do me a favor and get anyone who wants to come watch the exams to the academy around midday? That should be when the practical work begins, and I want to show everyone their hard work didn't go to waste," Naruto said while placing the now empty bowl in a sink to be washed later. "I don't see why not. Now get going or you'll be late," Integra said before walking towards the door. "Oh, also Schrödinger, you're on guard duty today," she said before disappearing out the kitchen door. "Yes," came the cry of the feline girl beside Naruto. She always seemed to enjoy guard duty, which consisted of basically following Naruto around the village while staying hidden as to keep him safe. They'd been teaching him how to defend himself, however he could maybe hold out against two genin long enough for someone to arrive. Though that was a lot better than being taken out by 3 civilians. Well, that's what Naruto thought anyway after getting beat so often so easily. Alright Shro, let's get going. I've got to get there early. Naruto said, and with that he started winding his way through the halls and corridors towards the front entrance to the manor. After getting to the academy, Naruto quickly wove his way through the growing crowd of children and parents who were dropping off the genin hopefuls for what many begged would be their final day at the academy. None paid any attention to Naruto as he wore different clothing and had a hood up over his head to hide his more defining features. He quickly made his way to the exam class and found a spot up the back in the corner. He then looked to the shadows and saw a pair of pink eyes and a mouth of sharp teeth looking at him. This was Schrödinger, of course. She'd seen a movie a long time ago called Alice in Wonderland and saw a cat that could make itself invisible, as thus recreated it in her own way. It was sometimes unsettling to know she was always watching. But Naruto quickly got over it. The face faded away when people started to file into the classroom and Iruka came soon after. He gave a small speech and wished everyone good luck before an unnamed Chunin passed out the tests. The man looked at Naruto oddly for a moment, then shrugged and set down the test. The moment Iruka called for the start, Naruto flipped his test and started. The written portion took quite some time to allow students to go in depth with their answers as well as answer everything due to just how much they expected a shinobi to know. After the tests were gathered up, Iruka stood and smiled at the class. Now we're heading outside for the practical side of the exam. You'll be tested in taijutsu as well as your ability to use ninja weapons such as shuriken and kunai. After that we'll come back in for the ninjutsu portion. And with that, everybody heading outside to see family members standing around talking and waiting to watch their children hopefully graduate. The students sat around on the grass and Naruto sat a little away from the rest under a tree with his book in hand. It only took a glance at the onlookers to see that all of the members of Hellsing were standing amongst them. He let out a small smile and went back to reading while keeping an ear out for his name. Naruto, Iruka called out. Said blonde quickly rose from his spot under the tree and put his book away. As he walked forwards he heard a few murmurs and then, wait. That's the dope, came the screech of one Sakura Haruno. The students now stared at the blonde. Naruto simply ignored them and walked up to the line that indicated where he was to throw from. He gathered up the required tools and took a long deep calming breath. Naruto pulled the hood up a little further to get the sun out of his eyes and focused right on the center of the training dummy. Then, in a series of spins and whole body motions he threw all the weapons. Some people were confused by his rather showy throwing technique, however those with skilled eyes realized it was all a matter of using the motion to increase the speed and power of the weapons, shown by the fact the kunai were buried up to 3/4 the blade in and the shuriken would require some tool to remove. Well done Naruto, you've really improved. The scarred Chunin then leaned in closer. And it looked pretty cool too. He said with a grin that Naruto mirrored at the instructor. He then walked back to his previous spot on the grass to wait for the last 3 or 4 people. He flashed a quick smile at the Hellsing group and a thumbs up. It was all thanks to them he'd even got this far. Naruto sat and waited for the last 5 or so people after him to go. He didn't really pay any attention to them as it was Ino, Sasuke and 3 civilian kids he never liked. That isn't to say he liked Ino or Sasuke. Ino had made up rumors about him since they were 5 as well as making fun of him with the rest of the kids as well as being a fangirl of Sasuke who Naruto grew to hate ever since he joined the academy. After the projectiles was the taijutsu. Naruto was decent after fighting with Ceres and Herod. Herod was a monster when it came to pure physical strength and Ceres was also inhumanly strong as well as tactile when it came to the art of hand-to-hand combat. Apparently since her main weapon, which was a large handheld cannon, wouldn't be available for a while with the time's technology, she took up a role of a frontliner. Naruto was broken from his thoughts and the phantom pains the friendly blonde and the stoic silver-haired women caused him when Iruka started speaking again. This part of the exam will consist of 2 students fighting against each. Will have a total of 10 minutes to ring out your opponent or subdue them. You are not to use anything except taijutsu in this fight, however, so long as it's taijutsu then there are no rules. With that out of the way, Mizuki and I will begin calling names. I will call one and Mizuki will call their opponent. Okay. It was about that point Naruto blanked out again in favor of reading from the book stashed in his coat with one ear listening for his own name. Naruto Uzumaki, Iruka called. The blonde grinned at hearing his name. Finally, I can show everyone they didn't waste their time, were the crimson-clad boy's thoughts as he stood up and dusted off his coat before walking to the ring. Iruka stood by. Mizuki gained a slightly demented grin at this. He'd planned to ruin the demon brat's chances during the written portion, however he'd been called away. However, this was an excellent opportunity. He could make sure the blonde lost as well as get in the good graces of the last Uchiha as well as the civilian council with this. Sasuke Uchiha. The Uchiha stood with a smirk and walked to the ring while the fangirls screeched and most of the males looked at Naruto in pity. The bandana-wearing Chunin walked forwards. I'll be referee for this match and if I say stop you stop. Understand? He got 2 nods in reply as Sasuke fell into the Uchiha clan's interceptor fist. Mizuki motioned the fight to start and both boys just stood there. One ready to go and the other standing there with his arms folded. Afraid, dope? Scared of getting beat by me again? You should be used to it. I mean, it's not like a loser like you could beat an Uchiha elite. Sasuke taunted at Naruto with a superior smirk in place. Naruto cocked an eyebrow at that. Uchiha elite? Elite of what exactly? I see one kid whose ego is far too large to sustain an undamaged psyche and a pile of corpses 6 feet under. There were 2 Uchiha I would ever spare a second glance. Your mother because she was a truly innocent and kind soul and your brother because he was willing to what was right. Not what he wanted. He protected those close to him at the cost of everything else. Naruto finished with a quick glance at the third who was sitting in the stands. He felt slightly nervous now. Did Naruto know? The raven-haired orphan flew into an instant frenzy at this. How dare you speak of that trash like they were worth something? My mother was too gentle to be an Uchiha and Itachi is a murderer. A murderer I will kill for what he did. He then rushed the blonde, completely foregoing his plan of using the interceptor fist to win and now just focused on hurting Naruto. The Uchiha threw a wild swing at Naruto's head with a vicious smirk as many of the crowd cheered on the boy's savage assault. The swing was caught by Naruto, who still had his other hand in his pocket. Maybe I underestimated my own skills? I guess sparring against Sarah's and Herod really paid off. He thought as phantom pains shot through his body. Though they caused his hand to loosen and Sasuke took the opportunity and smacked Naruto right in the face, making his ace snap backwards. Shaking his hand like he'd punched a brick wall, Sasuke looked back at Naruto, who'd yet to fall over. However, many assumed the great Uchiha had him. That is until Naruto's head slowly rolled to the side to look at Sasuke at an odd angle. You shouldn't have done that. He started cracking bones throughout his body before rolling his neck, getting a loud snap. He then turned to the little raven with a slightly demented smile. Because now I'm going to shove my foot so far up your ass you'll taste rubber for weeks. The blonde roared as he literally lunged at the Uchiha. Naruto instantly grasped his shoulders and used them to adjust himself to knee Sasuke in the face. He would have flown backward and not for Naruto's firm grip. He did however fall backwards with Naruto's knee now on his chest, and the moment his back hit the ground it caused another strike before Naruto quickly leapt off him and dropped low to the ground in a very predatory stance that reminded some of an Inuzuka. Come on, get up Sasuke, Naruto taunted. He'd been beaten by the fake prodigy too many times, it was Naruto's turn to hurt him. Sasuke shakily got to his feet but shook off the dizziness and refilled his lunges after that second hit caused them to release. You'll regret that, dope. However, before Sasuke could do anything, Naruto charged forwards and dropped into a spin which swept Sasuke's feet from under him. Naruto then preformed a handstand from there and used his legs to smack the airborne boy harshly to the ground before rising to his feet. Sasuke lay there on the ground not believing the dope beat him. He heard all over and thought something in his chest was bruised. That was when Mizuki called the match. He hadn't been expecting that at all. Naruto left the ring to once more sit by himself while Sasuke was taken to get some injuries looked after. Nothing serious but definitely some pain for a week. Naruto, you idiot, Sakura screeched. Why did you do that to Sasuke? The blonde for his part merely glanced at her with his now half-lidded eyes. Shut up, he said and kept walking. Sakura got mad at that and threw a punch at Naruto. He'd normally let her beat on him and she had gone into denial about him changing at all from the little idiot who always seemed to like her. However, her fist met with something too soon to be Naruto's head. Sakura looked wide-eyed as a cat-eared girl seemed to phase out of nothing. Her eyes were slitted, and though they were a bright pink, they were filled with barely restrained hate. Sakura's fist had connected with her open palm that quickly wrapped around her fist. "I don't suggest doing that again, or I'll remove the offending limb and offer it to the master as a trophy." Just to prove her point, the pink-eyed blonde applied pressure to Sakura's hand and it quickly sung out in a series of cracks and pops. The pinkette screamed as her hand was released and she fell back trying to get away from Schrödinger. Naruto turned and looked over his shoulder at the feline girl. "Thank you, Schrödinger," he said with a smile. Schrödinger for her part quickly changed her attitude and gave a large smile and a wave before once more vanishing from existence to watch over him. Sakura was also taken to get some of the bones in her hand put back in place. Schrödinger had rather masterfully dislocated all of Sakura's fingers in that hand. Nothing permanent, but it had hurt a lot. Due to them having to wait for the Uchiha as well as Sakura, they had a few moments to themselves to rest or speak to family. Naruto was sitting under a tree while speaking to the 8 other inhabitants of the Hellsing Manor. "You're doing rather well, master," said the surprisingly sweet Harriet. She was by far the tallest member of the group, standing close to 6 feet 8. Her body was hidden under a thick dark green coat with the collar turned up. Her silver hair hung out of a matching cap down to about her shoulder blades. Her body was fully in proportion to her height. Her eyes were a smoky gray color with small flecks of red. It was like the embers of a flame waiting to be ignited. Her attitude was rather militaristic and wouldn't ever call Naruto anything less than master. She personally felt it was an insult of his position. "Well, I definitely couldn't have done it without you and Sarah's. Those hand-to-hand lessons really helped," he responded with a smile that he reserved for when people he trusted were around. "Well, I dunno about that. I mean, I don't remember either of us teaching you any of that," Sarah's said with a smile. Though she lost a lot of her accent after so long, small bits and pieces sometimes surfaced when she was excited or happy. Sarah's was the second shortest of the group at around 5 feet 8, with Schrödinger being shortest at 5 feet 6. Her clothing consisted of a rather short skirt in a tan yellow color with matching shirt, long brown leather boots that laced up to just under her knees, and black skin-tight fingerless gloves. Her hair was rather close to that of Schrödinger's and Naruto's, and some would ever think Shro and Sarah's were related. Sarah's eyes were the most interesting part, as her left eye was a brilliant sky blue like Naruto's, while her right was a deep bloody crimson. It was a sign of the now coexistence between the vampire aspects of her mind and the more human thoughts. Yeah, it was weird. I just sort of knew what to do. After the asshole smacked me in the face, it all sort of just clicked in my head. Naruto then shrugged. Maybe I was just running on adrenaline from that hit. I have no idea. A slight giggle was heard. It was a slightly high-pitched but whole pleasant sound. Naruto looked towards the cause. A rather tall, thin woman with long flowing dark violet hair that brushed her ankles with more large curl on top of her head. "I'm just disappointed Schrödinger stopped the pink monkey. I was about to punish her with my rifle," she said while stroking the barrel of the oversized musket in her hand as sunlight glinted dangerously off her glasses. Naruto had seen something similar in a textbook about a projectile launcher being developed between Iron Country and Snow Country for Iron Samurai. Naruto simply sweat dropped. Rip Van Winkle was her name. She was a little sadistic and often mentioned how she would punish all who acted against Naruto without distinction. However, if there was one thing Naruto knew, it was that she was someone you could rely on to watch your back. "I'm just happy you didn't get carried away. I'm not really ready to explain to Gramps why someone got shot to pieces because of me," he said with a weak grin. "She's right though," spoke a woman matching Morgana's height and body shape, though her hair was short and a sandy blonde color while her skin had a healthy tan. Her accent was also rather thick. "Anyone tries something like that again and I'll bloody massacre the bastards," Alexis Anderson said while light also glinted off her glasses. Alexis was once a paladin for a religious order who hunted monsters such as vampires and werewolves. However, she defected when they turned her into a monster herself just to get an upper hand. That day the ex-holy women realized her faith was misplaced and devoted herself to the Hellsing family to repent her sins. "I don't really think we need to get violent now," came the meek voice of one Yumiko Takagi. She was a black-haired woman with equally black eyes that held sweetness and a deeply buried rage. She also wore her old uniform of a Catholic nun with a few changes. Instead of a cowl there was now a proper hood sewn into the neck, and the Hellsing family crest sat over her heart. She'd been left for dead by Iscariot and was brought along by Alexis, who was like a sister to the ex-sister. Alexis grinned and patted the girl on the back a little too hard. "Oh really?" she said with an all-too-sweet smile. "And what does Yumi have to say about this?" The pat had made Yumiko's glasses fly off her face, however they then hung around her neck due to a chain they connected to. Yumiko's personality seemed to rapidly shift and a grin stretched her face. She pulled back the hood to show a rather threatening face. "Someone tries to touch my god again and I will commit unspeakable sins to punish them," she said while gripping the sheathed blade she held in her hands tightly. Naruto was still a little nervous about the nun with multi-personality disorder after finding out the more violent side of her seemed to worship Naruto like her god. She'd do anything to keep him safe and happy. Proven by the fact she'd already killed 4 civilians who'd tried to sneak onto the grounds hoping to get the demon. The deaths couldn't be pinned as no one wanted to say they were going to the manor to attack the demon, as the Hokage would probably side with Naruto. The blonde put on a smile and looked to the nun. "Yumi, can you please put your glasses back on?" he asked sweetly. Despite her aggressive nature she was still sweet as honey towards Naruto. Apparent when her grin went from maniacal to sweet in a split second and with a, "Right away master." She placed the glasses back on before Yumiko quickly pulled the hood back up over her head. The young Hellsing head let out a silent breath he didn't know he was holding and went back to the last 2 members of the group. One was Integra, who was standing by quietly in a pair of long white dress pants, black dress shoes and a white coat with black trim decorated by the Hellsing family crest as well as yellowish gold decorations on the shoulders often seen on a decorated veteran soldier of their time. At her hips on her right side were 2 identical rapiers. Her weapon of choice. "Stop picking on Yumiko, Alexis." This came from the final member of the Hellsing staff besides Schrödinger, who was both there and not. Heinkel Wolf. She had short blonde hair like Alexis as well as a pair of black tinted glasses resting low on her nose. A cigarette hung from her mouth, currently unlit. Heinkel was ditched much like Yumiko and again brought to the Hellsing family by Alexis. And despite Alexis being older by a long time, Heinkel had this aura that reminded you of a stern mother or an older sister, and that was her position among the 3. Then again, everyone except Naruto had technically been alive, so long age really didn't matter to them. A small smile graced Naruto's face. Despite it only having been a week, Naruto had been readily accepted into the group that acted so much like a family, and it just felt nice to him. Soon after, Iruka came back out. "Can all students come into the building? We now need to preform the last part of the exams. Parents and families are free to wait around as this should take no more than an hour or 2. He called. The young magus quickly got up but stopped when he felt a hand on his shoulder. Naruto looked back to a smiling Morgana. "Remember, this part is all up to you. We're not able to manipulate mana like you are because we didn't start until later in life. However, you will be able to use it for a lot more. But no matter what, I'm rooting for you." The Ravenette let out a large toothy grin and looked over her shoulder to the group who were joined by Schrödinger. Naruto followed her line of vision before Morgana looked back. "We're rooting for you," she corrected. Naruto smiled and nodded. "Then I guess I'll have to pass because there's no way I'm letting you all down." His excitement got the better of him and a bit of his older energetic personality leaked out. His emotion mask that had held up since he was 5 was starting to crack. And if Naruto were honest with himself, he wasn't sure if it was a bad thing. With that, the group watched their master walk quickly to catch up to the group. Morgana finally let out the breath she was holding. It's only been a week since his Hellsing blood started to reveal itself, and the feelings are already things strong. The vampiress thought out loud while looking at the group. All of whole had similar thoughts and looks. Naruto was receiving a few dirty looks from the girls in the class, however he wasn't paying attention. Since they'd entered the room, he'd had his nose in his book. One Kiba Inuzuka was giving him the dirtiest look of all. The self-proclaimed alpha of the class had seen Naruto sitting around with a group of babes that he thought should be talking to himself instead of the dead last of the class. Finally his thoughts got the better of him and he rose while storming over to the blonde. "Oi dope," he shouted as he approached. Naruto didn't react to the call as he had better things to do, like trying to work out some final kinks from his fake jutsu. As such, Kiba got even more annoyed at being ignored and snatched the book from his hand. Your betters are speaking to you dead last, so you better listen. He then looked to the book in his hand. What the hell is this trash anyway? He said as he started reading the book before breaking out into a laughing fit. Bahaha, the dope is trying to read poetry. What a sissy, he shouted without noticing the straining of Naruto's hand as well as the twitching of his eye. Kiba, then trying to further the blonde's humiliation, started reading the last line visible on the book. Even if the morrow is barren of promises, nothing shall forestall my return. He repeated with a posh-sounding tone. What junk. He then threw the book over his shoulder, not caring when it didn't actually hit the ground but vanished after being caught by an unseen hand. "Ah, that was a good laugh there, dope," he said while wiping tears from his eyes. "But back to business. I saw you with some hot chicks before. How about you do your alpha a little deed and send them my way next time? I'm sure they'd like me more over a dead last like you. Plus they had some really nice tea." Kiba was abruptly cut off by a fist in his face, before literally rag-dolling across the room through a few desks and finally stopping with his head buried in the wall. The class was in silence as Naruto took large heaving breaths to try and calm himself down while his head hung and his face was covered by his hair. "You can insult me. You can insult my book. You can insult anything I do." He stopped and looked up with a menacing look on his face that promised unspeakable suffering. They also noticed his voice seemed gravely. "But if you ever insult my precious people, then I don't care if you're the heir to a clan, the son of the Hokage himself, or the goddamn fire daimyo. I will hunt you down and shove my foot so far up my ass you'll taste rubber for the rest of your life." And with that said, he sat back down and went back to reading. When Iruka came to retrieve the next student, he was a little shocked to see the entire class staring at a seemingly angry Naruto while a clear path had been cut through the room from said blonde to an unconscious Kiba who had yet to be pulled from the wall. After making sure the Inuzuka heir was going to be okay, he took the boy into the exam room and he came out a little dizzy, but he did have a headband and left to go show off. XXXXXXXXX. The 2-hour mark was approaching when Iruka came from the room and called on Naruto, who got up and walked down the stairs to the Chunin and followed him into a separate room. "Okay Naruto, you know what needs to be done, but we will remind you. You need to preform a transformation for us to judge, at least 3 functioning clones as well as replacing with an object. Begin when you're ready." Naruto nodded and closed his eyes before taking a deep soothing breath to concentrate. He muttered a few quick words under his breath before a circle appeared underneath him and quickly rose up. When it passed over the top of him, gone was Naruto, and before them stood a perfect clone of Iruka. The Iruka in TH seat looked slightly shocked and nodded. "Not bad. What do you think, Mizuki?" he asked of the ashen-haired Chunin next to him. Mizuki might not like it, but even he had to admit it was a good transformation. "It's passable." It was only then another Iruka came in through the door. "Naruto, why'd you do that?" he asked while slightly shocked to see himself at the table and where Naruto had been. Both of the Iruka in the room broke out into grins a little too much like Naruto's before both were covered by that circle again to reveal 2 identical Naruto. "Well, considering what I did, I feel I pass," he said. "Actually Naruto, you needed to preform 3 clones. You only have 1 working clone." At that moment another Mizuki walked up behind Iruka. "He got you too, huh?" he asked with anger clear in his voice. That was when the seated Mizuki started laughing before turning into another Naruto. "That's still only 2 clones, Naruto," Mizuki said, hoping to still fail the Kyuubi brat. "He's got a point, Iruka," said a voice from behind the 2. Both Chunin slumped slightly as another Naruto was peering in the door behind them. "Fine, you pass, Naruto, just take a headband and leave." Iruka sighed. He was over the blonde's joke. One of the clones at the table the a headband on a red cloth at the one at the door before all 3 seemingly just faded away without any signs of existing. However, both Chunin were busy looking at Naruto with shock, as something clicked in their heads. They were solid, they both said. Naruto nodded with a casual look on his face as he tied the headband around his neck. "Yeah, normal clones are actually a lot harder than solid clones. You've got to make something that doesn't exist while not letting it exist. I have a friend who's a master of existing and not existing at the same time, and even she can't do it, so what's my chances?" he said while shrugging and walking off. Mizuki just had a sour look and walked in to take his seat while Iruka had a slightly broken look on his face before shaking it off and calling the next student. He really didn't want to think about what Naruto just said due to fear that it might start making sense. Naruto left the academy and was quickly intercepted by the Hellsing group. All of whom gave the boy a good job in their own ways. Whether it was an over-exaggerated thumbs up from Schrödinger and Sarah's or a quiet, well done, from Yumiko, it still brought a smile to the young blonde's face knowing that they cared. Okay, that's enough, called Integra. How about we all head back to the manor and throw a little celebration? The tan women said with a smile as they all headed back to the large home. Upon opening the doors, Naruto found a large banner that said, "Congratulations," in bright colors. His face lit up at the sight. He'd never really celebrated anything, so it was quite a nice feeling. But what really got to him was that they believed he'd passed to the point of already setting up a small party for him. They'd only known him a week and already cared more than anyone had in his short but severe life. It wasn't long until everyone sans Naruto had started drinking and were telling stories of when they first met. He was quite surprised to hear about how they were all on different sides of a war. However, was happy to see they had no grudges from back then. He knew about Alexis, Heinkel and Yumiko having been from the Iscariot group, but was even more surprised to hear that Rip, Herod and Shro were from their mutual enemy. Apparently after all was said and done they were forced into it. They had Rip chipped and would kill her if she disobeyed orders, while Shro was experimented on and they had a different fail-safe that would stop her form coming back to life. Herod stuck around because her and Schrödinger were rather close. Now the group were sitting in a sunken lounge area with a large sofa in a square with more than enough space for them all to sit comfortably. Integra stood up. "Well, we've all had fun tonight, however I believe it's time for the main event," she announced as everyone except Naruto got a knowing or excited smile. The pale blonde then walked over to a table with a long case Naruto had noticed. She picked up the case and walked over to Naruto. "This is an artifice passed down through the Hellsing line. Every head of the family has had access to this during their time, however few have what it takes to wield it." As this was said, the case was opened to reveal a rather stunning blade. The whole thing was taller than Naruto, with a lot of its length being the blade, which was a deep crimson, with the edges being polished metal, the fuller having some decorative ornaments covering it. The whole thing was reminiscent of a rapier, though it was a lot longer and wider to allow swings, though still being able to thrust just fine at the cost of being heavier. The cross guard was made up of what looked like two wings that spread out, when the knuckle guard was a much more detailed third wing that then turned into the pommel, which wrapped around a sky blue gem that was of magic origin as a black mist swirled within, while its twin sat in the rain guard between the two wings. The grip was wrapped in clean black leather. The whole blade seemed to radiate with a sort of power as Naruto gazed with him mouth slightly open. He was broken from his stupor when Integra removed the blade from its case while putting the case down and holding by the handle and halfway up the blade. "As a past head to the Hellsing family, it is my honor to present you with our family's most prized treasure, the Crimson Wing." The younger blonde was mesmerized by the blade. He slowly wrapped his hand around the handle, and when the blade lifted with ease, Naruto was shocked. It weighed almost nothing at all. Integra, Alexis and Yumiko had been teaching him some basic swordplay, so he gave it a few test swings and found it unnaturally easy to wield for him. "It seems the blade has accepted you. If it hadn't, I doubt you'd have been able to lift it with two hands, let alone one," Integra explained with a smile. Naruto nodded to show he heard her, but he could also hear something else, like a whisper in his mind. It was telling him what to do, and Naruto decided to do as it said, so with a flourish he focused on the blade and called upon his mana while wishing the blade to disappear. In a quick flash of bloody crimson light, the blade was gone as three feathers fell to the ground before they themselves disappearing. Naruto then felt a slight tingle on his left hand and saw some light through the glove that seemed to burn onto the material. It was a basic symbol of a sword that pointed toward his knuckles with two wings spread from the hilt and wrapping around the blade. After a quick check, it was confirmed the same symbol was on the boy's hand in the same fashion in place. The voice once more spoke to Naruto, telling him what to do. This time H focused on the symbol and pushed mana into it. The symbol seemed to bleed red for a moment, and then he had to quickly grasp as the hilt of the blade appeared in his palm before the rest came into existence. "Wow," was all Naruto said, Clapping was heard and Naruto looked to find everyone smiling and clapping for him. Integra once again was the one to speak. Now that the Blades accepted you, you're officially the head of the Hellsing family. While it was possible for others of the Hellsing blood with a high enough potency to take the position, the Blade has solidified your position by accepting you and none may contest it now. Congratulations. Then she did something Naruto thought he'd never see the proud Vami Press do. She gave a deep bow before Naruto, which was copied by everyone else. The blonde just smiled and scratched the back of his head nervously. Thanks. Ehehehe. The blonde then yawned. I'm pretty tired so I'm going to catch some sleep. See you all in the morning. And with that Naruto retired for the night. It had been a good day for him. He now had a week to train again before his team would be assigned. I wonder who it'll be, he thought before drifting off. Just as he did, the mark on his hand glowed brightly before fading. Don't go, Naruto screamed out as he shot up in his bed breathing hard. A normal morning for the boy as he'd been plagued by realistic nightmares all his life. Don't go, he whispered again as he started to calm himself down. Then he noticed something drip from his face. He touched his cheek and removed his hand to see it was wet. He'd been crying in his sleep? Naruto shook it off and got out of the large bed before heading for the bathroom. The blonde splashed some water in his face to calm himself down. His hands stopped shaking and he held himself up on the sink. Naruto's head still drooped. The dreams had been getting progressively worse as of late. Yet when he woke he couldn't remember anything but blurs and messed up sounds. It had been a week since he graduated from the academy and he'd been training till he dropped with all the girls, so maybe it was JSUT, some kind of byproduct of the exhaustion. He finally felt better and stood up straight. The moment he caught sight of himself in the mirror he froze. Everything around him seemed to fade away as he JSUT stared at his reflecting and it stared back. Then the entire village was woken at 5 a.m. by a scream. What? Half an hour later Naruto stood before the members of Hellsing, hair still dripping with the glare to end all glares. Who did it? He said dangerously. It really doesn't look that bad to be honest, Morgana said truthfully and got a round of agreements from the group. Naruto instant got right up in the Ravenette's face. Was that a confession? He asked. Morgana placed her hand on his face and pushed him back slightly. No, it was not, and I don't know what the big deal is anyway, it looks fine, so why are you getting upset? This time genuine curiosity in her voice. Naruto raised his hand and went "RO respond." Then froze. He thought for a good minute, his mouth still hanging open, and then he lowered his hand, slowly closed his mouth and just walked away. Sarah spoke up as Air Master stomped off. You know I always liked redheads, she said casually while a few of them nodded in agreement. Naruto walked into the academy with the hood of his coat up. Despite having come to terms with the fact, he both came to terms with it and he didn't care about other opinions of him. Naruto didn't much feel like dealing with his soon-to-be ex-classmates. He took up a position at the back of the class and started reading. However, he didn't get to for long. Haha, look at Kiba, got his clock cleaned by the dead last. One of the civilians taunted the dog boy, who had a rather dark bruise on the side of his face and a few teeth missing. Kiba just gave them dirty looks as he couldn't talk properly with the swelling. They continued to taunt him for a few minutes until one of them was smacked in the back of the head. The other was back-fisted by Naruto and fell to the floor. Leave the dog alone and let him lick his wounds. I swear, kicking the dog while he's down. You're both worse than he is, Naruto said to the unconscious forms of the boys. Kiba stared at Naruto with incautious glare. Why'd you defend me? He managed to mumble out despite the slight pain. Naruto just looked at the dog boy from inside his hood. I may not like you, Kiba, but I'll be damned before I let someone get picked on over something I caused. I hit you to teach you a lesson, not make you a target. And with that he stepped over the two boys and went back to his seat. A few of the class were surprised that Naruto defended Kiba since he was the reason Kiba was like that. However, Naruto ignored it in favor of waiting for Iruka. Again, the wait was rather short-lived as the scarred Chunin showed up as the two boys were waking up. He looked confused when they stumbled off to some seat, but otherwise ignored it in favor of giving his usual speech on the life of a shinobi. He then went on to list the teams. Naruto spaced out during 1 through 6 and came back at 7. All the civilian genin were gone, leaving the clan heirs, so he was curious about the rest. Iruka cleared his throat. Team 7 will consist of Sasuke Uchiha, Sakura Har, Yees. The pinkette interrupted with her banshee screech. Iruka picked at his ear for a moment to stop the ringing before continuing. As I was saying, Sakura Haruno and Naruto Uzumaki. You will be under Kakashi Hatake. Sakura seemed depressed at this point and Naruto smirked. This was good for him because he'd probably be able to skip out on team training in favor of training with the Hellsing members due to the fact Kakashi was probably chosen to teach Sasuke about the Sharingan. He was probably only there as fodder. The rest of the teams were announced as a remake of the Inishikacho trio under the Hokage's son Asuma and a tracking team with Kiba Shino and Hinata under a young Jonin Genjutsu specialist. As Naruto again guessed, his was the last team waiting. He knew of Kakashi's chronic lateness due to him having read up on all the Jonin eligible for teams. He continued to read for the next 2.5 hours while occasionally glancing at his teammates to soak in their suffering. It was fun for him. When their sensei did show up, Naruto was still reading. Sasuke looked constipated trying to keep up his uncaring facade and Sakura was beating her head against a desk. Though the moment the door opened, Sakura spun and screeched, "You're late." At the Cyclops, Kakashi seemed unfazed. "My first impression of you, I hate you." He was about to continue only for his eyes to widen when Naruto turned slightly and cocked his head. You say something?" He droned much like the silver-haired Jonin would to his rival, Might Guy. "He stole my bit," Kakashi thought indignantly. "Meet me on the roof," was all he said before puffing out of existence, signifying it as a shadow clone. Naruto for his part shrugged and left, having actually not heard the Jonin but brushed it aside. Sasuke followed shortly after with a grunt while Sakura followed the last Uchiha like a lost puppy. All the while thinking it was Naruto's fault their new sensei didn't like them. When the three genin arrived on the roof, they were greeted by the sight of Kakashi leaning against the railing while reading from a little orange book. He gave one last small glare at Naruto before eyes smiling at the other two. "Well, since we're all here, I think introductions are in order. Start with your name, your likes and dislikes, hobbies and any dreams for the future," he said. Sakura seemed a little confused. "Why don't you go first? Give us an idea," she said, and Kakashi huffed. They couldn't ever just do as he told them. Always with the questions. "Well, my name is Kakashi Hatake. I don't really have any dislikes and my likes are a little mature for you, as are my hobbies. As for dreams for the future, I don't really have any," he said with a shrug and an eye smile. Naruto was not impressed at all by his attempt to keep them in the dark. However, he'd dig up info on the man later. Now he was busy face-palming at the sappy, fangirly crap flying from Sakura's mouth. "My dislikes are Ino Pig and Naruto. My hobbies," giggle and glance at Sasuke. "And my dream for the future." Again giggles and glances at Sasuke. The Uchiha just grunted while Kakashi looked downtrodden. However, Naruto was actually dry retching at what he'd just heard. Like he was going to vomit. "Shut up, idiot, like you've got any better." Sakura once more screeched out at Naruto, who stopped his act and grinned. He flipped back the hood, revealing his now straight red hair that swept backwards in a tufty feathered look while a few bangs hung over his forehead. The rest went to the base of his neck on the back and sides. "My name is Naruto Uzumaki Hellsing. I like training with the other members of Hellsing and practicing my arts. I also enjoy reading. I dislike people who belittle others for their own amusement. Rapists, pedophiles and people who can't tell the difference between a sword and its sheath. My hobbies include reading poetry, as Kiba so kindly pointed out the other day in class, and playing the piano or violin. My dream for the future is to restore the Hellsing family and organizations to their prime and to lead the family like my ancestors before me." With that he finished and took in their faces. He wasn't sure, but they seemed to still be processing the hair. After the shock wore off, Kakashi informed them of the secondary test and left them. Sakura, being the encyclopedia she is, questioned him on it, finding out that the exam was just to see if that had the basic skills. This would see how they react to a combat situation. Naruto didn't really mind, as the graduation exam was too easy in his opinion, and this just meant they weren't sending ill-prepared kids to their deaths. As for Kakashi's advice, that was advice that Naruto would respectfully decline. He had gone without food for a long time and knew it did no one any good. So he would accept a delicious if lighter meal and would show up at 9. 2 hours later then he again suggested. Naruto walked into the Hellsing Manor just as it seemed the rest of the group were winding down a meeting. They'd been discussing starting to take on mercenary work and had gotten a license from the Hokage to operate inside the village for now. However, unlike ninja, they wouldn't be taking jobs like weeding someone's garden. It was to secure income for the Hellsing family and to give them something to do while Naruto was off on missions. Though a three-man squad would always accompany Naruto. It was part of an agreement that allowed Konoha to hire them at a discounted fee if they ever needed to. The room they were all in had been decidedly called the mission room. There were a few tables with maps and such all around the room, while a large empty notice board would be up for them as well as future organization members to take jobs from. "Am I interrupting something?" Naruto asked as he strolled in and sat on a table. "Not at all. We just finished up for the morning, which means it's time for training," Integra said with a slightly cruel but also teasing smirk. "Try not to be too harsh today. I've got another test tomorrow and I have a feeling I'll need to be in peak condition to pass this one." And with that said, the rest of the day was spent training Naruto. The next morning finds Naruto walking towards Training Ground 7 around 9 o'clock in the morning. It was an odd day in Fire Country as the weather was very cold and foggy mist blanketed the roads and ground today, as well as the sky being overcast. Naruto had the collar on his coat flipped up and the hood up over that to keep the old at bay. He then came upon the sorry sight of his half-asleep, half-frozen teammates. "Oh come on, really? Let me guess you didn't eat anything either." This was answered by a pair of growling stomachs. "For the love of Kami. The least you could have done was wear something warmer." He didn't even mention that. Naruto ranted as the two simply glared at him in his thicker coat. That was when Kakashi decided to make an appearance wearing a thicker outfit with a scarf due to the weather. "Good to see you all here on time," he said with a slightly mocking eye smile. Sakura growled slightly. "Actually, you and Naruto are 2 hours late," she chattered out. Kakashi mocked surprise and looked at a watch that wasn't there. "Huh, you're right, sorry about that," he said, still giving that eye smile. Sakura growled again and Sasuke grunted. "Anyway, you have until midday to get these bells off me. If you fail to do so, you'll be sent back to the academy," he said while pulling out 2 bells. "But wait, doesn't that mean one of us is getting sent back no matter what?" "There's only 2 bells," Sakura asked. She thought this might be her chance to get on a team alone with Sasuke. Kakashi again feigned shock. "I guess you're right. One of you is getting sent back no matter what." With that said, Kakashi placed down the timer and set it for 3 hours. "Okay, begin." With that said, Sasuke and Sakura disappeared into the foliage while Naruto stood there with his arms crossed. "Naruto, aren't you going to go hide?" he asked with a raised eyebrow. "What's the point of hiding from you, Kakashi? You can summon Hunter Ninken. If worst came to be, you'd use them to seek me out," Naruto said while Kakashi was surprised the redhead knew that. Naruto caught onto his surprise and smirked. "What, you didn't think I would come into this blind, did you? A proper ninja's best tool is information, and a good ninja uses anything available to them. I got a friend of mine to dig up some information about you. Now, let's do this." Naruto got into a ready stance and watched as Kakashi reached into his weapons pouch and retrieved a book. That annoyed Naruto to no end. Even he wasn't rude enough to read while fighting. Then he saw the title and his rage only grew. He was being raised by 9 women recently and had quickly picked up a trait a lot of women have: an ungodly hate towards perverts. Kakashi wasn't really paying attention and only barely focused on Naruto. So when a fireball the size of his head flew right in front of his face and singed a few hairs and most importantly 3/4 of his book, he was wide-eyed. He still held the remains of the smut as his head jerkily turned to Naruto. "Did you just?" He left the question hanging. Naruto smirked as his right-hand glove still had a few wisps of smoke coming off it. "That's right, I killed your smut," he said with a crooked grin. Kakashi quickly discarded the burnt remains of the book and drew a kunai. He was rather upset with the student now. First he burns his precious Icha, then he insults it right in Kakashi's face. The Cyclops was going to make him pay. This was what Naruto wanted, and his grin grew a little. With a flourish, Crimson Wing came to life in his hand. He stood with his left arm behind him as he leaned forwards with his right hand in front. He looked like he was ready to pounce at the silver-haired Jonin. Although the fact that Glove hadn't stopped smoking despite no signs of and singing on it were worrisome. Naruto took the initiative and leapt at the Cyclops with a downward swing of his blade that was blocked by Kakashi. Only then he realized his chest felt hot and saw a fireball in Naruto's palm. Just as the ball of fire launched from the redhead's hand, Kakashi swapped with a long that was instantly burnt to a crisp and blown up. Kakashi noted that the fireball technique wasn't just for burning. It seemed they were explosive as well. Naruto landed in the crouched stance again. Kakashi also noted it seemed the stance was for offense instead of defense. So taking advantage of that he quickly flew through some hand signs. You know what they say, Naruto, fight fire with fire. Fire style. Great fireball jutsu. Was called as Kakashi breathed out a decently sized fireball that rolled towards Naruto, scorching the earth in its path. However, Naruto didn't move and simply grinned wider as he was engulfed by the flames. The Jonin as well as the hiding Pinkette and Uchiha were either surprised, worried or cruelly enough happy that Naruto had taken the fireball head-on. However, their worries were unwarranted when the boy stood completely fine with what looked like a light blue sphere surrounding him. Not even the grass inside the sphere was scorched by the fires. The blue light died down and Naruto once more leapt at Kakashi with another downward slash. It almost worked the first time, Naruto, but not this time. Kakashi said as he instead blocked and kicked the blonde away only for it to fade like an illusion. That was a clone, he thought in alarm. But where's the real one? Kakashi checked his sides as well as his flank but didn't catch sight of the blonde turned redhead. Could he know an earth technique? Kakashi thought as he searched the ground for any disturbances. You know humanity's problem? Came the voice of Naruto. It sounded like it came from everywhere at once. We rarely look up. This time it distinctively came from above Kakashi and he barely rolled out of the way of a spinning double axe kick that left a sizable dent in the ground where Kakashi had been a moment ago. Once more he was impressed simply by the skill that a fresh genin showed. Strength most chunin didn't possess, tactical abilities, strange techniques that would keep an enemy guessing as well as proficiency with a weapon other than those taught in the academy. Just to name a few. Naruto then formed a shape with his right hand and it stopped smoking before the boy chanted something quickly and a circle flashed for a brief moment below him. Then something weird happened. Naruto's shadow started moving independently. It started to crawl out of the ground in a way and when it finally stood it too on a shape and color. It was a physical exact copy of Naruto, however it was monochromatic. Its skin was a gray color with a lighter gray for its hair. Instead of red clothing it wore black and gray. Though its eyes were a deep crimson red color. The thing took on a more feral version of Naruto's stance and grinned with a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. It also bounced on its feet, seeming to be itching to fight. Get the bells, Naruto ordered. The monochromatic clone nodded and leapt forwards with a flurry of swings. Its attacks were noticeably more ferocious than Naruto's own. Though they lacked the tact his did in favor of trying to break Kakashi with brute force. The silver-haired Cyclops found an opening and took a swing only for his arm to pass right through like the shadow wasn't there. He'd think it was an illusion if not for the fact his bones were still rattling after its hard swings. Naruto again took notice of Kakashi's confusion and decided to explain. You like it? It's my own version of a shadow clone. Instead of being a chakra construct I infuse my shadow with a part of my soul or being that I don't use as often such as instinct and aggression and then animate it. Though he lacks my level of mental capability his instincts are extremely good. He will also do anything I command. The best part is he can hit you all he likes however you can't hit him. Naruto said with a rather proud tone of voice. That spell had taken a large amount of time to get into a combat-ready position. Kakashi had to swap with a log again and watched the thing getting cleaved clean in half down the middle by the swing he just avoided. If that had been him, Kakashi would be done. The silver-haired Jonin discarded his kunai as it was starting to break under the endless assault and pulled out another one just in time to block another swing. Coming up with an idea, Kakashi quickly drew another kunai and threw it at Naruto. The shadow instantly turned into a puff of black smoky wisps and moved at blinding speeds to intercept the projectile. He caught it and threw it back at Kakashi. The blood redhead smiled at him finding out so quickly. Well done. You realized I'm vulnerable while he's out. I can't really move more than speak until he returns. However, I plan to fix this in the future. Now return shadow. Naruto ordered. In another cloud of smoke the shadow flew at Naruto before enveloping him and slithering down the boy to his feet before stretching out. Naruto himself stretched his stiff muscles from holding the same position for so long. He let out a relieved-sounding sigh. That's better, it's weird losing those feelings. I act too smart. He then dropped into his stance again. Alright Kakashi, one last attempt to get you down. With that said, Naruto held his blade over his head with the tip pointing towards the ground. He then started chanting as he ran his hand from his crossguard as far along the blade as he could before flicking his hand forwards. As his hand slid over, runes lit up on both sides of the blade in a language they couldn't understand. Now Naruto stood with the blade covered in the strange glowing runes. Prepare yourself. I'm not holding back, and with that Naruto swung his blade out in front of him. Despite being over 30 feet away, Kakashi prepared and watched as the blade's tip glowed brighter before releasing what appeared to be a crescent of energy in his direction. Dodging out of the way, he was relieved as the blade kept going through the forest, cutting down trees for quite some distance. However, it wasn't over as Naruto started swinging again. Again, this fresh genin shocked a seasoned jonin and ex-Anbu. He could use a skill like that so quickly? This crescent was a lot wider, however Kakashi noted that the cutting power seemed to decrease the larger it was. Naruto started swinging rapidly, letting off waves of different sizes to throw off the jonin who just kept dodging. Then he watched the genin take a different stance with the tip pointed at him and the blade drawn back ready to thrust. And thrust he did. Like before, the tip glowed, only this time the projectile moved a lot faster and appeared like a large spinning drill. It his Araka bore a hole straight through. Then the timer sounded and Kakashi let out a small breath. He'd been hoping time would run out soon. Sasuke and Sakura were so caught up in watching the dead last fight off a jonin they hadn't moved for 3 hours. Now they'd failed. The three stood in front of Kakashi. Sorry, but you three fail. You didn't get the B. He'd reached back to grab them only to realize they weren't there. What? Where are they? He asked himself more than the genin. That is until the sound of the bells tingling came from Naruto, who held both bells in his hand. Kakashi did a quick check for an illusion only to find out they were real. When did you? When you shot the fireball at me and stared while waiting to see what happened. Remember, that was a clone. I got behind you and took them when you were focused on the clone. So I guess I pass. He said with a more fox-like grin. Well, who are you going to give the other bell to? Remember, the one without a bell goes back to the academy. He reminded. Naruto raised an eyebrow at this. Bullshit. Who ever heard of a two-man team? Not only that, but I already know you're being forced to accept the Uchiha by the civilian council, and Pinky is here because of her mother's spot on said council. So I will give the other bell to my shadow because he did more work today than these two combined. He threw the bell in the air and the shadow's arm came from Naruto's normal shadow and snatched it out of the air. The bell actually going it with it. Kakashi just sighed and shook his head. Whatever. Be at the mission hall at 9 tomorrow and don't be late. With that he was gone in a swirl of leaves. Hey dope, teach me those techniques. Sasuke demanded. Naruto just looked over his shoulder at them with a scowl. Kill yourself, was all he said as he walked off, ignoring the screams of Sakura and the angry glare of Sasuke. The Hokage sat in his office waiting for the last jonin to arrive. His test had taken the longest. Kakashi arrived in a swirl of leaves and looked slightly defeated. He then reached for his equipment pouch for his book only to be reminded Naruto incinerated it. His shoulders then slumped even more. Now that we're all here, I want reports on who passed and failed. Hiruzen said. Team 1 failed. Team 2 failed. Team 3 failed. Team 3 failed. Team 4 failed. Team 5 failed. Team 6 failed. Team 7 passed. This got a few strange looks. Naruto's file is way off. It says he's a dead last with nothing going for him besides taijutsu, which is only any good due to brute strength. The Naruto I fought showed several different skill sets not even seen in most chunin. He played mind games with me at the start by burning my book to get me angry, which led to me making a mistake later in the fight. He was strong enough to compact the ground with a kick, showed a mind for tactics as well as showcasing multi-skills I've never heard of. Also, his ninjutsu were strange. He barely preformed hand signs and they were some rather unique. Top of that, he's proficient with a strange sword, he said, once more sounding deflated. Everyone was a little surprised. That the boy they'd read about could do all that. I'll have it looked into. Hiruzen stated. He had a feeling he knew what was going on. Kurenai, assume your teams. Team 8 passed. Team 10 passed. Good. The teams that passed will start D ranks as soon as you think they're ready. The sensei of the teams who failed will return to regular duty as of tomorrow. Dismissed. With that everyone left and Hiruzen sat back with his pipe deep in thought. The sun had set a few hours ago and Naruto stood out in the middle on training ground 7. He decided to train by himself today so he had some time to think. He went over the test today. He'd revealed Crimson Wing, 2 of Crimson Wing's arts as well as his Shadow Clone and Fireball spells. That wasn't a whole lot but it was more than enough to prove he wasn't the same kid as he was only a few weeks ago. I guess I'll just have to wait and see what happens. Naruto thought as he picked his coat up off the ground. Somewhere else in Konoha a drunken Anko Mitarashi had just left a bar after celebrating with her team on a job well done. Anko wasn't sure why she felt so sluggish because she hadn't had that many drinks but after just throwing it under being tired from the mission she strolled through the darkened streets of Konoha on her way home. That was until as the special Jonin passed a darkened alley she was dragged in by a set of hands over her mouth and chest. "Look at this boys, we caught us a little snake whore," said what Anko recognized as one of her team from the mission. "Look at you, always walking around with a sway in your hips wearing such skimpy clothing. It's only fair we let you take care of all these problems you caused us," he said with a wicked sneer. Anko tried to struggle out of his grip, however it felt like her limbs were made of cement. Then it hit her like a sack of bricks. They'd drugged her. The snake mistress had been caught up in the celebration she didn't notice. "Bingo, now why don't you put that pretty little mouth of yours to good use?" With that said he ripped the mesh on her chest away and started undoing his pants while the men surrounding them sneered at a frightened Anko. Despite the rumors she was actually still a virgin. Who'd want to be with the snake whore, or the student of a traitor? Just as the deed was about to be done the sound of humming permeated the air. It sounded similar to lullaby or a song children would sing. There was no distinctive direction it was coming from. The attempted rapists stopped in their tracks as they got an odd chill from the sound. As they looked around the alley for the source, the sound finally gave them a source in the form of a crimson-clad hooded figure standing at the end of the alley. "The hell are you looking at?" the leader yelled. "I'm not quite sure, but it's disgusting to even think about it," was the answer given, laced with malice, hatred and loathing. "Oh, don't tell me you're going to stick up for the snake whore," the man yelled. "I don't see a whore. I see a group of men around what looks like a drugged woman about to have their way with her. Now let her go." The figure now stood with his arms crossed as his eyes pierced the darkness and seemingly their souls. "Screw you. Let's just kill the bastard," the leader said again. He then dropped his hold on Anko's hair and pulled a kunai while starting forwards only to stop when no sound came from behind him. Then a bell seemed to tingle behind him. He slowly turned and jumped backwards when he came face to face with a monochromatic copy of the man at the alley's end. The sound of the bell came from the bell that was tied in the copy's hair. However, instead of looking deathly serious, this one looks murderously gleeful. That image was increased tenfold by the 4 dead bodies laying around the floor with their necks slit. Even the blood on the long blade he held took on a monochromatic appearance. The shadow then pointed back in front of the man with its grin stretching wider. The leader silently turned back to the Crimson One and again jumped back through the shadow as Naruto was right in his face as well. Anko just stared at the sight, not quite sure what was scarier. Her almost rapists of this embodiment of hatred that seemed to enjoy what it was doing to the man. "We're going to play a little game," the Crimson One said. "If you live, then I'd better never hear of you doing anything like this ever again. Or I will find you. But if you die, then I guess the gods think you deserve it." The man was literally pissing himself at the intense ki radiating from the man like a furnace. What? He stuttered. "We're going to play Simon Says. If you do something Simon doesn't say, then you'll be punished. Now, Simon Says stand against the wall," Naruto said with a cruel smirk. The shadow lifted the man roughly up and there him against the wall. "Raise your right hand," Naruto ordered. The man did as told, only to scream out in pain as a kunai then pinned the hand to the wall. "I did what you said," he screamed. "Yes, you did what I said. But Simon didn't tell you to do it, so I punished you," Naruto shouted back. Anko for her part found this sick and twisted children's game to be oddly entertaining, and the sadistic nature this person seemed to have attracted her. "Let's try again," Naruto breathed, sounding calm again. Simon says stand on one leg. The man did it told and Naruto smiled. Good, he said cheerily with a little clap. Simon says clap your hands. The man looked at the hand nailed to the wall and slowly moved his other hand towards it. I said clap your hands. Naruto bellowed. The man started clapping only to shout out again when his left hand was nailed to his right with another kunai. But you said, the man moaned in pain as tears started flowing down his face. He dropped the leg he'd been holding up and the ankle was nailed to the wall as well. You need to pay attention. The rules change. You see, Simon told you to clap, then I told you to clap. And no one told you to drop your leg. The manic redhead once more shouted in the scared fool's face. Naruto looked truly distressed with this man. He walked in circles for a moment, seemingly trying to calm himself. He then quickly turned and got up in the Jonin's face again. He grabbed the man's face and looked him straight in the eyes. Okay, he said very rapidly, getting quieter and quieter. I'm going to give you one last chance. Nod if you understand, he very quietly. The man nodded quickly, but he went wide-eyed when he realized. I didn't say, Simon says. Naruto said cruelly before jamming a kunai through the man's skull. Naruto's shadow slithered back to the ground and faded into his regular shadow. The seemingly unstable Hellsing head then turned and stepped away from the man while an exact copy seemed to phase out of him and started cleaning up the bodies on the ground. The real Naruto crouched down in front of Anko, who still had yet to see his face. No need to be scared. He deserved that. You don't. Now what's your address? I don't think you'll be getting there on your own. He said with a warmer smile. The hood seemed to shadow everything from the mouth up. Even his cheeks were shadowed. Anko thought over giving this psychopath her home address but eventually decided to. He hadn't actually done anything and something about him made her want to trust him. So the purpleette relented and soon after she was swept up in a bridal carry and they were flying over the rooftops of Konoha. An hour later Naruto came through the doors of the Hellsing Manor with a shit-eating grin plastered on his face. Welcome home, master, Harriet said as she'd been walking past the door. Good night, I guess? Morgana asked as she'd been with Harriet. Naruto nodded. Yeah, I played some games. It was a good night, he said, grinning and walking off. What the redhead didn't realize was the fact his face was literally painted crimson. The Hokage sat at his desk staring at the pictures of a crime scene found this morning. It showed 4 corpses seemingly kneeling around a 5th who was nailed to the wall like they were praying to it. Around the nailed-up corpse's neck was a sign that read, "A rapist and his followers." The only thing they all had in common was that they'd all just returned from a mission. The only member of the team not dead in the alley was Anko Mitarashi, who had just finished explaining what she could. So we've got a psychotic serial killer in the village. Hiruzen mumbled angrily. Anko shook her head. I don't think so. He took me home and even tucked me into bed. He killed them for trying to rape me. I don't think he's a serial killer. More like an angel of death. Her expression grew somewhat dreamy at the memory of the crimson-clad hero who saved her. Hiruzen seemed to grow concerned. We'll have to look into this, he said before dismissing the snake mistress and going over the files. Well done, Naruto. Well done, he thought with a smile. 3 months had passed since the official forming of Team 7. 3 months since Naruto passed the exam and shortly after fought of a Jonin-level ninja in a spar. But none of this was the most pressing issue. Alone with all of that, the most important thing was 3 whole months of D-rank missions alongside the pink one, as Naruto started calling Sakura and Sasuke, as he'd taken to calling the Uchiha. It wasn't the D-ranks themselves that got to Naruto. Most of the time they were something not too stressful. One of them even convinced him to take up gardening in the Hellsing Manor. No, it was the pain of listening to the Uchiha constantly flaunt his self-imposed superiority while Sakura agreed and sung praise of the jack-off. On top of that, they constantly bitched and moaned at the Hokage of all people about Sasuke deserving a better mission. Naruto had a scowl on his face as he looked at himself in the mirror of his bathroom. This was becoming a little too routing for the redhead. He'd wake up shaking and feeling sick and unable to think clearly due to some dream he had. He'd then go to the bathroom and 3/5 times throw up. He'd then stare at himself in the mirror until he felt like he was okay. Water dripped from Naruto's lengthening straight bloody red hair as he supported himself over the sink. He'd need to fix this soon before it became more of a problem. How was he going to cope with missions outside the village like this? But these were questions for later. Right now he had to be at the mission office. Kakashi had informed them he'd try for a C rank today, so maybe things would go a little better. After stumbling around his room and taking note of the increasingly thick black rings around his eyes, Naruto was outfitted in his basic red garb. After taking some medication that had been prescribed to him by a therapist the Hokage had made him go see, the young Hellsing head left his large bedroom out into the hall, backing a beeline for the kitchen. As he walked, many men and women who were now working in the manner of servants nodded or bowed to their young master as he walked past. That was another thing. The others had started receiving requests for work from different places after a good work from the Hokage got out. Most of it was C ranks that a village hadn't gotten around to yet, but it was still work. Often they'd come back having saved some poor bastard who'd been kidnapped or something, and they'd work for the manor. Naruto absent-mindedly noted a lot of them were female. This is starting to become a theme. He muttered darkly. Another few minutes of grumbling and walking found Naruto in the kitchen downing a cup of coffee. That was a habit of Integra's he'd finally realized the logic behind. People were idiots. And only a good cup of coffee can prepare you for idiots first thing in the morning. The kitchen staff, who were mostly cleaning the already reflectively clean surfaces of metal benches, were smart in avoiding Naruto at this point. He leaned against one of the benches with a scowl, half-lidded eyes and his coffee mug almost glued to his face. "Morning, master," came the loud and sunny sound of one Sarah's Victoria. Naruto closed his eyes tightly and cringed at the sound before setting his glare on the now shorter than him blonde. "You know they say people who are happy in the morning are more likely to be murderers." Naruto monotoned sourly. Sarah's just replied with a smirk showing a mouth of razor-sharp teeth. "I'm a vampire, remember? I'm already a paid murderer and you're just grumpy." She finished with a light whack on the arm. Naruto stared at her before slouching further. "It's too early for logic," was his reply. Sarah's laughed again. "Whatever. When do you leave to get your mission?" the Draculina asked. Naruto glanced at the clock and downed the rest of the bitter liquid. "Now, I'll see you later," he said while patting Sarah's on the shoulder as he strolled past. "See ya," Sarah's called and gave a rather energetic wave. Naruto simply smirked. He knew that despite her somewhat childish personality, Sarah's was a war machine. She was, for lack of a better term, the heavy artillery. When the situation called for it, she could do a full 180 and become deadly serious. At first he had multi-personality disorder like Yumiko. However, that was quickly put down by the rest of the group. Naruto left the manor and headed for the mission hall, where he would once more meet with the curse he had for a team and more than likely receive a D rank. He then cringed at the idea. Not that he would say anything. Sakura and Sasuke still hadn't gotten it through their heads that Kakashi was about 2 hours late to everything they did. So they'd been sitting outside the mission office for a good 2 hours when Naruto strolled up reading from his white-covered poetry book. "You're late again, Naruto," Sakura shouted as he approached. Naruto, for his part, looked up at them half-lidded and bored. "You're really bad at this, aren't you?" was all he said before Kakashi popped up in a swirl of leaves. He took stock of the situation and sighed. The team was no closer than on day one. "Alright, let's all go inside and see about getting a mission," he said with a clap and an eye smile. With that, the group quickly entered the mission room. The three Genin and Kakashi stood in a line in front of Hiruzen, who was on duty alongside Iruka due to him having only taught the graduation class this year and there still being another month before the new year. "Ah, good morning. Come for another D rank? We've got RRRRARGH. I've had it with these D ranks. It's beneath an Uchiha elite such as myself. Give us a C rank," shouted Sasuke, having interrupted the Hokage. Naruto glanced over the top of his book. "Sounds like someone took it too far up last night and now he's butt hurt." Naruto muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Another development was Naruto almost constantly questioning Sasuke's. Hiruzen bit his fist as not to laugh and covered it up by coughing into his hand. "Yes, well. As befitting as it is for you to be doing this, lick everyone else, Sasuke. It's not up to you to determine when you're ready for higher grade missions." He then glanced at Kakashi, who looked about to speak. "Actually, I was going to request a C rank for my team. I feel they are at least ready to perform something like that, and there's little to no chance of much of a threat, let alone one I can't handle." I also feel it would be a good idea for them to get outside the village. Kakashi explained. Hiruzen looked at the three genin before locking eyes with Naruto and nodding. Very well, however I'll be sending some outside help to back you up on this mission, it's non-negotiable. Please send Tazuna in, Hiruzen called. Team 7 watched as a stout pot-bellied man wearing a rice farmer's hat with a bottle of sake in his hand walked in. He smelled strongly of alcohol, and the moment he laid eyes on the team his eyes narrowed. What the hell is this? I asked for a team of shinobi, not a one-eyed scarecrow, a cross-dresser, a brooder and a. He stopped speaking upon looking directly at Naruto. Naruto had quickly closed his collar and put the hood up. With done there was only a small sliver of pitch-black space that his eyes could be see almost glowing through. Tazuna stared into the black abyss that was Naruto's hood, and as he did flashes of those he loved dying crossed before his mind. The sounds of screaming could be heard as fires roared and monsters growled and laughed. He promptly fell over unconscious. Everyone stared wide-eyed at Naruto. The sheer concentration of the ki he just unleashed was both remarkable and unnatural. A human being, no matter how sick and twisted, should not be able to summon up that much intent to end another life for such a small thing as a potential insult. Naruto, for his part, looked at them all with his hood and collar still up. What? He said. Kakashi just shook his head while Sakura avoided looking at her crimson-clad teammate, and Sasuke had thoughts about how he'd force Naruto to give him that power. Just meet at the gate in an hour, he said before grabbing Tazuna and disappearing in a shunshin. Naruto shrugged and went to walk off. Naruto, could to stay here for a minute. Sarutobi called and received a nod before Naruto walked up. Sasuke became curious and stuck around outside the door, hoping to hear what the dope was wanted for. Sakura stuck around because Sasuke did. Could you pick up a team from the Hellsing organization and take them with you? Something about this request doesn't seem right to me, and I've got a bad feeling. And you don't get to my age in this world by ignoring bad feelings. I'm more than willing to pay the regular fee, he explained and handed Naruto a scroll. That's the authentication on the matter if Kakashi questions it, as well as the mission statement for the group. Naruto nodded and took the scroll. Yeah, sure Gramps. See you later, he said with a wave over his shoulder. As Naruto stepped outside, Sasuke got in his way. What was the Hokage talking to you about in there? What were those things he mentioned, and what's in that scroll? He said the last part, trying to grab the scroll only to get a knuckle to the nose. Sakura scrambled to help the now downed Uchiha up, and Naruto just scowled harder. I don't see how that any of your damn business. He then walked past towards the manor. Naruto walked into the manor and ran into Integra. Just the women I was looking for, Naruto said with a smile. I got a C rank that Gramps thinks is a little fishy. He wants me to bring a team with me. Who's available? Integra took the scroll and ran over it quickly before nodding as everything was in place. Hellsing and Millennium are preparing for a job, however Iscariot are available. Integra explained. Naruto nodded. Iscariot referred to the division set up within the Hellsing organization that focused on fields such as ninjutsu, sealing, barriers, and any other skills that are not of a natural occurrence, so magic. The organization was being divided 3 ways, with the other 2 being Hellsing itself, who focused on being heavy-hitting all-rounders that were basic teams armed with decent equipment, and Millennium, who were more of an R&D division focused on creating and testing experimental equipment, as well as more heavily focused groups. The divisions were headed by groups of 3, being Integra Morgana and Ceres for Hellsing, Heinkel Alexis and Yumiko for Iscariot, and Herod, Shro and Rip for Millennium. This was of course all a future affair, as they needed to acquire more funds and resources before any of this could be obtained. Naruto walked off to look for the 3 members of Iscariot to inform them of the mission. An hour later finds Naruto walking up the largest street in Konoha. It leads straight from the main gate to the Hokage's tower in the center of the village. Sakura and Sasuke were sitting around with Tazuna close by, now conscious and drinking, and Kakashi reading his book. Who are they, Naruto? Kakashi asked while eyeing the 3 women a little too intensely for Naruto's liking. He threw the scroll the Hokage had given him to the Cyclops, and a few moments later he nodded. Alright, this is the help he spoke about, so let's get moving, Kakashi said, and the group headed out of Konoha. It wasn't long before the questions started to fly. Sakura was constantly blabbering on and on to Tazuna about Wave Country, which was their destination in Tazuna's homeland. That is until a shadow loomed over Sakura. The pinkette turned slowly to see Alexis towering over her. She had a sickly sweet smile on her face with her eyes closed and all her teeth bared in a grin. Naruto recognized this as her sister face. Normally a comforting sight if there wasn't so much barely contained anger behind it that appeared as leaking ki. How about you shut your trap for a while, Pinky, before I kill ye? You're annoyin' the master, she said with her accent changing the pronunciation of some of the words. Sakura got confused for a moment at the master comment until she realized all three women were sticking rather close to Naruto. Naruto is your master? Why would you serve a loser like him? She asked. Yeah, why serve a clanless loser when you could serve me? An Uchiha elite. Sasuke added his 2 cents. Alexis just started twitching and was about to kill the pair of them before Heinkel's hand landed on her shoulder. The smoking blonde then pointed at Yumiko, who was taking her glasses off. How about we let Yumi handle this one? With that, the two blondes got out of the way as the sweet and kind Yumiko was replaced with the violent and aggressive Yumi. Naruto watched in amusement as Yumi lunged at the two and started preaching about Naruto being a god compared to the two of them. He'd be lying if he said he didn't like it, but he didn't want to get a big head. So he politely asked Yumi to let them off with a warning so the group could continue on. Further down the road, a pair of Kiri missing nin sat by the side of the road. They were the demon brothers and they were being hired to kill the bridge builder and his escort. They're late, one said as he lied on the ground staring at the tree limbs above them. I know, replied the other. Don't they know it's rude to be later, Gozu? The first asked again. I guess not, Maizu. The second answered, starting to lose his patience with his younger twin brother. Why do you think they're late? Maizu asked. I don't know, Maizu. Maybe they went and got lunch first. Hey Gozu, wanna go get lunch after we kill them? The two-horned brother asked of his elder sibling. Sure, why not? Gozu replied with a sigh. This was really starting to grate on his nerves. What do you want to get for lunch? I think I'm gonna get some octopus balls. Maizu said while thinking about lunch more than the mission now. I don't know, Maizu. I'll see what I feel like when we get there. Gozu was literally at his wits' end already. Sometimes it worried him what was wrong with his twin. The duo fell into silence for a moment and the single-horned demon brother let out a sigh. Hey look, someone's coming, Maizu said, having now sat up to see some figures on the horizon. Gozu took a long intake of breath to verbally abuse his brother before processing what was said and quickly climbing the tree. He retrieved a pair of binoculars from his cloak and took a closer look. That's them all right, but there's way more than we were told. We were told that it would be the bridge builder and a team of 4, not 7. I don't think we should fight them. Let's head back and report this to Zabuza. Gozu said and jumped down while stashing the binoculars away in his cloak again. Maizu seemed thoughtful for a moment. Does this mean we can go get lunch sooner? He asked hopeful. Gozu slapped himself in the face. Just hurry up. And with that the two ran off into the woods. Back with the Konoha Hellsing group, Naruto yawned a little. Getting tired already, dope? Sasuke quipped. The redhead of the group just glared and decided to ignore the closet. It would be a few hours more before the group stopped in a clearing a while of the road to set up camp. Sasuke and Kakashi set up their single-man tents while Alexis set up a rather large tent that could easily house 4 people. Tazuna also set up a tent he'd been carrying. That was when everyone realized something and Naruto was the one to voice it. Sakura, you didn't bring a tent, did you? He asked, seemingly unsurprised. Sakura decided to try and hide her embarrassment with aggression. Where do you expect me to put a tent? I needed to make room for my makeup. Besides, I don't see you setting up a tent either. She howled. Kakashi and Tazuna were actually curious about that as well. The redhead hadn't set up either. Sasuke just smirked, thinking Naruto had messed up and that somehow translated to himself being superior. Naruto, however, merely jerked a thumb over his shoulder to the tent Alexis had set up. Alexis, Heinkel and Yumiko were kind enough to let me bunk with them, he said with a mocking grin. He wasn't ignorant towards what that situation meant at all. He simply didn't care. He had long since gotten over the idea of morals after living in the Hellsing Manor. It wasn't an uncommon sight to see one of the women he lives with walking around half naked. They played it off as resistance to seduction training for Naruto, who merely let them play their games. Alexis walked up behind Naruto smiling and leaned forwards while draping her arm over his shoulders. Let you bunk with us? she asked, mocking shock. That got a few glares as they all thought Naruto was lying now. We had to hide your tent and force you to not sleep in a tree for the entire trip, she said with a shit-eating grin. Heinkel was standing further away also grinning while Yumiko giggled. We didn't hide it, remember? We burned it, Heinkel called as she lit the cigarette in her mouth. Now the rest of the group had slack jaws. They went that far to force the boy to sleep in the tent with them. Naruto chuckled and scratched the back of his head. Well, same thing I guess. After that Tazuna and Kakashi kept giving the younger boy dirty looks at his ungodly luck. They may be scary as hell, but those women were hot. When the point of who would take watch, Naruto pointed out he could just release his shadow. He wouldn't need to move while sleeping, and so long as he was rested, it was rested. It would also be able to handle anything if something did happen. So the group retired for the night after Naruto released his shadow into the world and then was taken into the tent. That night Naruto suffered far less nightmares and had one of the most comfortable nights he'd ever had. It was an odd sensation to wake up slowly and comfortably for Naruto. He was so used to shooting out of bed in a cold sweat feeling like death's hand was on his shoulder that he wasn't sure this wasn't a very vivid dream. The pillows were soft and comfortable and smelt sweet. And his body felt warm and secure. To test the waters, Naruto slowly cracked an eye open. He quickly realized that all was not as it seemed. Naruto lay in a tangled mess of limbs with his head resting on Alexis's chest while Heinkel and Yumiko had somehow wound themselves around his body. He then tried to move on to realize something. His shadow was still out there and he was stuck. He mentally shrugged and let things flow as they do. That was until an unconscious Alexis wrapped her arms around her master's head in her sleep and pulled his face right into her cleavage. If it weren't for the lack of oxygen, Naruto would have no reason to complain. But as fate would have it, his vision started going black around the edges. However, much to his relief, Naruto's shadow sensed the impending doom to its master and quickly returned, allowing him to pry his head from the valley of death and wonder. Naruto took large gasping breaths before realizing he'd woken the trio up with his daring escape. Alexis was looking pleased with herself while Heinkel was frowning at her fellow blonde and Yumi was rubbing sleep from her eyes. Yumiko had to sleep without her glasses, otherwise the moment she lost consciousness she'd wake as Yumi. Naruto just glared at the busty paladin. Shut up, he said bitterly. He still wasn't a morning person and there was no coffee here, so despite not waking in a horrible fashion, he yet again felt death's embrace first thing in the morning. But if he was honest, it wasn't a bad way to go, really. Naruto took a few glances at the girls taking in their forms. Normally they wore pretty bulky clothing, so now that they were stripped to the bare minimum he couldn't resist. Naruto was by no stretch a pervert. He just had a healthy respect for women. Alexis was rather tall at 6'1" with a solid build that looked like that of an athlete or a fighter. Muscles was compacted and streamlined to allow maneuverability while still packing a decent punch. Long toned legs, widened hips and a large E-cup bust. Her skin had a healthy tan, suggesting a decent amount of time spent in the sun. A rather good-looking woman if he was honest. Heinkel was rather similar. However, whereas Alexis had more defined muscles, Heinkel looked more like a runner. Her body showed the telltale signs of relying on speed over brute strength. Long, strong-looking legs with compacted hips, a flat stomach and a generous D-cup giving her a strong but womanly build. Yumiko was by far the most surprising. Her shy personality as Yumiko and her covering clothing would make one believe she was weak of body. However, that was farce. Years of fighting alongside her sisters had given her a body suited to being flexible and agile like that of a gymnast. Though that's not to say she wasn't attractive. Widely flared hips and a flat stomach lead to her generous DDs that, like her sisters, seemed to defy gravity despite their size and showed no sag. Naruto quickly averted his eyes and went about tying his boots on. They'd need to be ready to leave soon after the rest of Naruto's team woke up. So stretching his arms out, he left the tent and started setting up a quick fire with a small fireball and using some of their rations to make something. An hour of waiting passed before Sakura and Sasuke emerged. Kakashi had an extra tent that the Pinkette had ended up using. Tazuna and said Cyclops had joined them nearly 45 minutes ago. I see the princess and Pinky have decided to join us after their beauty sleep, Naruto said with a small grin. Sakura was in no mood to deal with Naruto after the uncomfortable stay. She was used to being comfortable, so she lashed out. "Shut it, Naruto. It's not like you'd know anything about beauty sleep, you raccoon-eyed loser." Everyone expected a response, only for Naruto to grow silent at the mention of the dark rings that were still growing ever more visible. Despite having not woken up in a panic, he still didn't actually sleep much that night, and the fact Sakura mentioned it reminded him of that feeling he always woke up with. It was like he was suffocating on the air itself. Like something horrible was about to happen. Sakura took a triumphant pose as she'd made the redhead shut up for once. Sasuke filed away the sensitive topic for future use while the three Iscariot girls tried to cheer up their depressed master. When the group was on the move again, Naruto remained quiet while his thoughts swam through his head. He walked with his head bowed. Occasionally Sakura would look at the boy. "Geez, what a wuss," she thought. However, she'd quickly turn away when she was on the receiving end of three rather nasty glares. They crossed the water and were in waves soon enough, and with the disembark came the mist. 2 hours into wave country and visibility was rapidly reaching zero. Then the call of, "Get down," came from Kakashi. However, instead of dropping like the rest, Naruto and the Iscariot girls remained upright while Alexis put her arm out and caught the blade of an oversized butcher's blade. She then threw it back into the mist in the same direction it came from. The mist lit up enough to see that in front of the group were Zabuza Momochi alongside the demon brothers standing on top of a large lake. "Kakashi Hatake, I can understand why the demon brothers came back now. Though I'm surprised that you stopped my blade." The last part being said with a raised non-existent eyebrow. Kakashi was put off by the presence of the ex-Kiri ninja being here in wave. He glanced towards Tazuna, who was looking extremely nervous for just a moment. "I wasn't the one that stopped your sword," Kakashi said. "What? Then who did?" "I know one of those two brats didn't?" Zabuza asked, his lack of eyebrow rising higher. "Wait a second, weren't there more of them, brother?" Maizu asked, now looking around. "Wait, there they are," he announced, now pointing at Naruto's group, who still stood slightly in the mist. "So that was your overgrown butcher's knife that nearly hit my master?" Alexis asked with her sweet smile on her face. 4 bayonets fell from each of her sleeve and were then grasped between her fingers. "I guess I'm gonna have to kill y'all, then." The last part was said with her smile turning murderous. In a blur, the bayonet-wielding blonde was right in front of Zabuza and with a quick swipe, cleaved straight through the expert swordsman. Only instead of blood, the corpse exploded into water. "TCH. Alexis grunted before just as quickly backing away from the lake. "You know more about this enemy than I do, Scarecrow. I'll leave him up to you." Kakashi nodded in response as the real Zabuza appeared on the lake with a water shunshin and quickly made a few more water clones that ran at the bridge builder. Gozu and Maizu were quick to spam water clones till there were 4 of each of them plus the real ones, and engages Heinkel and Yumiko in a game of, which one's the real one. Yumiko was wrapped in the chains of one of the pairs and was unable to move. Thinking quick, she whipped her head forwards hard enough to remove her glasses. The moment they came off, ki radiated from her as bangs of hair shadowed her eyes and her mouth twisted into a sickly, gleeful grin. The sound of metal straining was heard as the sharp edges of the chain dug into her. Yet despite blood being drawn, she continued till there was enough space to slip out of the constricting chains. The sleeves of her clothing were torn to all but shreds and soaked through with blood. Yumi ripped the tattered mess of cloth off to reveal her arms were thoroughly cut up with chunks missing. So the brothers thought this would be easy. That is until a hissing sound came from the direction of the grinning nun. Steam seemed to float off her arms as the many painful-looking wounds sizzled and hissed before closing up like the damage was never done, and her arms were once again flawless besides the blood that was on them. The psychotic nun removed the hood and raised her head enough for one of her eyes to peer through the bangs covering her face. "My turn," was all that was said before she gripped the hilt of her blade and in an instant stood on the other side of the 2 watery clones now sheathing her blade. The clones seemed stunned for a second before looking down as hundreds of cuts seemed to slowly open all over their bodies. None were enough to make them dispel, however it made moving without dispelling difficult. Though they were taking up a far more watery appearance now. "I hope you can handle more than that, or this is going to be boring," the sadistic nun said before turning towards the damaged clones who were joined by another pair. A sadistic grin split Yumi's face. Heinkel was having a different time with her opponents. The first attempt to constrict her had been thwarted when she pulled out a larger than normal trench knife and cut the chain completely in half. So now the four demon brothers were attacking her with their poisoned claws. One of the large claws passed right by the blonde's face, missing by mere inches and taking the cigarette right out of her mouth. Just as quickly as the claw passed, Heinkel smashed her fist and by extension the knuckles of the trench knife right into the attacker's face. A sick squelch followed before the clone popped like a balloon. The blonde then had to dodge 3 more claws. As the gauntlets hit the ground she'd been standing on, Heinkel gave the large pieces of metal a good axe kick, burying them up to the wrist. While the 3 clones tried to free themselves, the chain smoker took a new cigarette from her inner coat pocket and lit it. A large breath was taken before she sighed the smoke out. That's much better. The response came in the form of the clones finally freeing their weapons from the earth. Now then, hurry up and drop dead, she said viscously before charging while brandishing her blade. Naruto threw a fireball at Maizu, forcing him to dodge out of the way towards his brother as the chain wouldn't allow him to go further. The redhead quickly followed up with another of the destructive projectiles now aimed at Gozu. Damn it, Gozu cursed as he tried to dodge only to smack into his younger brother. Ha ha ha, came a gleeful chuckle from Naruto, who was getting some kind of sick entertainment from messing with the siblings. The 2 brothers quickly rolled away from each other when a fireball collided with the ground where they'd both just been. This brat's toying with us, Gozu shouted enraged. They were the demon brothers Gozu and Maizu, masters of coordinated combat, and now some brat was making them struggle against one another. Maizu, let's teach the brat a lesson, he shouted while making a half ram with his unhindered arm. Right brother, let's get him good. Maizu then mirrored the action with his opposite hand. Naruto raised an eyebrow in curiosity. So far all they'd done was try and wrap him up in that chain of theirs. Sure, it looked nasty, but it wasn't that hard to get out of. Then a burst of chakra went off and both disappeared from sight, only to reappear behind Naruto with the chain now pressing against his stomach. They vanished again in a blur of speed, over and over again, reappearing for only a moment as the chain quickly encased Naruto's arms and torso. We win, the brothers said at the same time and tried to eviscerate the redhead with the sharp edges of the chain. Only the moment they tugged they were met with no resistance and the wrappings around Naruto fell to pieces. Both brothers stared wide-eyed as the monochromatic Naruto stood in a way that suggested he'd just cut the chains. Nice timing, Naruto said to the shadow, who just grinned wider before nodding and returning to its position on the ground. Now, the crimson-clad boy said, making it sound like a threat and a promise of pain. Try not to scream, he said before summoning the Crimson Wing and leaping at the brothers to let the torture begin. Alexis was holding up fairly well considering it was 4v1 with her against 4 copies of an admittedly difficult foe. It wasn't so much his skill that was formidable as much as the brute strength he put into his swings, as well as the weight and reach of his Zanbatsu. The weapon allowed Zabuza to swing freely at his enemy from a decent distance, and if Alexis tried to get within the guard of one clone, the other 3 would be quick to bar her path and force her back. Right now it was more a battle of attrition, and she knew she could win it. One of the clones took a wide swing that extended just a little too far, and Alexis was quick to take her chance. She thrust her bayonet straight at the clone's exposed chest and was greeted by the sound of blade meeting flesh. The clone grinned as he watched the busty blonde's arm get severed at the elbow by one of the other clones. However, what they didn't expect was for her to continue forwards with the noticeably not bleeding stump. The moment the mutilated limb touched the chest of the water clone in front of her, the clones were again shocked at the sight of hundreds of small thorny red vines to burst from the muscle and slither all around the now destabilized watery clone. It soon burst and fell to the ground as nothing but a puddle. The vines then retracted slightly, it twirled around on one another before taking on a shape noticeably similar to an arm before flesh and skin seemed to grow onto it. No matter how many times I see you do that, I still think it's really cool, Naruto said with a smile while standing next to the bloody corpse of the demon brothers. And with their deaths came Yumi and Heinkel to join them as the clones had dispelled upon their creators' deaths. The group's attention was quickly called to Kakashi and the real Zabuza by the sound of Kakashi's shout. The sight their eyes fell on was not a pleasant one. Kakashi is now trapped by Zabuza in a spherical water prison, while another 4 water clones joined the 3 already before of them. Naruto noticed Zabuza's hand on the prison and quickly formulated a plan. Yumi, Heinkel, Alexis, he shouted, getting their attention. Form up on myself and the bridge builder. I'm going to free Kakashi, he said. That drew confused glances from Sakura, Sasuke and Tazuna, all of which had been basically hiding behind everyone else. Why would you take our client anywhere near the enemy dope? Sasuke asked smugly. The redhead of the group grinned knowingly. Come now Sasuke, you should know me better than that. It was then he muttered something under his breath and a large dark runic circle appeared beneath his feet. Naruto stood up straight and crossed his arms. Naruto's shadow started skittering across the ground before rising up behind the clones and in front of Zabuza. What's with the light show this time? Didn't he pop up normally before? Tazuna asked, having seen Naruto's shadow free him from the chains. For a civilian you're rather observant. Naruto said in regards to the bridge builder. You're right, however that was because I've been working on a method to allow myself movement while he's out. I made some progress in the fact I no longer need to summon him if he's only standing on my shadow. However, to move any further than that I need to summon him properly and lose control of my body. Naruto explained. I need to get him to teach me that jutsu. That power belongs to me and I'm sure I'd be better at it. Sasuke thought while scowling at Naruto. Sakura noticed Sasuke's glare and thought Naruto did something to annoy him, so she joined him in the glaring. Alexis, Yumi and Heinkel were quick to try and distract the clones while Naruto's shadow now stared down the real Zabuza. Well, aren't you scary looking? Zabuza pointed out. The shadow simply grinned wide and showed of its pointed teeth before lunging at Zabuza, who swung his large blade at the shadow only to be shocked when it passed straight through. He quickly released his hold of Kakashi, who was now suffering chakra exhaustion for having had his Sharingan out since engaging Zabuza. The shadow did as it always did in a fight and attacked with an unrelenting assault of powerful blows. Not allowing enough time to do anything but get ready to block the next strike. It was one of the benefits of not suffering fatigue. However, try as he might, the shadow's attacks were all being blocked by Zabuza. At this rate they'd be here forever. So decided to step its game up. The shadow jumped backwards and quickly ran its hand over the blade of its version of Crimson Wing. While when Naruto did this, the runes flashed in a light red color. The shadows were all pure white on black. Just as quickly as it disengaged from its target, the shadow was once more on Zabuza like a bat out of hell. And now the magical abilities of the blade were being added to the battering. The edge on his blade was glowing and it started actually biting into the metal of Zabuza's own. The ex-Kiri Nin was starting to worry a little. If his sword broke, there wasn't enough blood in range to repair it fully, and he'd have no time to cast an jutsu against his seemingly phantasmal adversary without suffering major damage, and he couldn't be sure it would even be to any effect after watching his blade pass clean through without a scratch. However, his salvation came in the form of a high-pitched scream from back on the land, and in an instant the shadow was reduced to nothing but smoke and whizzed back to its owner at breakneck speeds. Back on the land, everything was moving in slow motion to those watching. One of the clones had gotten past the 3 Iscariot members and had a beeline for the bridge builder. However, Sakura stood in its way. So it went to cleave her in half, at which point she screamed and substituted with the first thing that came to mind. Unfortunately, that thing was Naruto, as she'd only just looked away from the frozen red head after glaring at him along with Sasuke. Now Naruto stood right in front of the incoming blade and was unable to move. However, the shadow appeared just in time to change the direction of the weapon. However, it wasn't enough to get away unscathed. Naruto now sported a dean gushing slash all the way down his right arm from shoulder to the back of his hand. The shadow returned to its master and Naruto instantly screamed in pain and clutched the mutilated limb. The water clones then all dispelled as Zabuza had used the chaos to slip away from the area. The 3 members of Iscariot were quick to Naruto's side and started trying to get him to let go of his arm. The wound was too big to cut the blood flow and he was only making it worse. Tazuna informed them he lived not too far away. So Yumi and Heinkel Gentle carried the howling redhead while Alexis grabbed the exhausted Cyclops, and they quickly left the area for Tazuna's house to treat their injured master. The whole way Sakura was hyperventilating as she was under an ungodly amount of ki. The rest of the day as well as the night was saturated with the sound of Naruto screaming his throat dry before being forcefully put under. Naruto now slept on a futon in one of the spare rooms in Tazuna's house. His right arm was wrapped heavily in bandages while his face and brow showed signs of intense discomfort. His eyes moved frantically behind his eyelids and sweat poured off his extremely pale face. "How's he holding up?" Heinkel asked, walking into the room with some food. Yumiko was kneeling on the floor with her hands in her lap right next to Naruto's shaking form. She'd been there and hadn't moved since they'd arrived. Alexis sat further away, sprawled out with her back against the wall. One leg propping up her arm while the other went straight out. In both her hands were bayonet at the ready. Like Yumiko, she hadn't left the room. Heinkel was the only one willing to do so, and that was only for a cigarette or to retrieve things such as the food she'd now handed off to her two companions while she dug into her own. Yumiko was the one to answer her question. "He's not really gotten any better or any worse. Not to say that's a good thing considering how he was before we put him under," she answered quietly. Silence followed as nothing needed to be said. The only thing any of them did was wish for the safety and well-being of their master. A knock was heard against the door. "May I come in? It's Kakashi," came the voice. "Come in," Heinkel answered, being closest to door, having taken up her spot right next to it. Kakashi opened the door and stepped inside. "Tazuna has informed us of the situation. Apparently the country is under the thumb of a tyrant named Gato. He's a wealthy businessman who runs a shipping company and has taken over all exports on the island, basically bleeding it dry. It seems he hired Zabuza to take out the bridge builder as well as our team to make an example. We've decided to continue with our mission, and what about our master?" He can't continue like this," Alexis snapped. "I was getting to that. I've just received word from Konoha and a medic squad left Konoha 3 hours ago. They should be here tomorrow night if all goes well. We've been told so long as we can keep Naruto sedated and his heart rate down. It was also concluded from the symptoms we gave them that Zabuza's weapon was coated in a quick-acting, nasty acidic poison, as the blade he uses is only known to drain blood. However, it could be possible that when the blood was drained the poison was circulated quicker into his system," Kakashi explained carefully while being as serious as possible. "He might not really show it, but he had nothing really against Naruto. He just reminded the Scarecrow too much of someone he lost." With that out of the way, the group processed the rest of what Kakashi said. "So this, Gato, is the reason for our master's suffering?" Heinkel asked evenly, although hatred and disgust practically dripped from the name. Kakashi only replied with a nod. "Then he dies," Alexis stated simply. "He dies because if it weren't for him this wouldn't be happening." It was as simple as that. Blame the gunman, not the gun. Again silence reigned over the room until the sound of root steps coming up the hall caught everyone's attention. "Hey Kakashi!" Sakura suddenly fell silent as she was once again under the full brunt of the three women's immense ki. "Get out!" It was barely a whisper with a slight whimper. What?" Sakura asked, truly scared now. That was when the quietest and more reserved member of their team snapped. "I said get out!" Yumiko screamed with tears streaming from her puffy red eyes down her face. "This is all your fault. You did this to him." Yumiko then threw her glasses off and charged the object of her master's pain with her blade drawn. Alexis and Heinkel instantly reacted and stopped Yumi from decapitating the girl, but not before Sakura got a long deep gash going from one cheek across the bridge of her nose and onto the other cheek. The pink-haired genin cried out and clutched her face while Kakashi grabbed her and quickly took her out of the room and away from the still struggling sword wielder. "Yumi, stop it right now," Heinkel shouted in her ear. "We all decided we'd leave the girl be for now," Alexis continued. "We can't let her get away with this. Look what she did to him." The dark-haired nun screamed, however she'd stopped struggling as much. "She will not get away with it," Heinkel said darkly. "You're not the only one who wants her dead, but we were hired to make sure they got back to Konoha in one piece. Anything less makes the Hellsing organization look bad. It makes our master look bad. So we will wait. We will complete this mission. And when no one is watching we will put that miserable bitch down like the dog she is." She continued while letting her rage seep out as she spoke the words. Now Yumi had stopped completely and walked back over to where her glasses as landed and put them back on before slumping back down in front of Naruto with her head bowed and her face hidden. In the other room Kakashi had applied a salve to Sakura's face after having to knock her out. Apparently the girl had absolutely zero tolerance for pain. He'd now wrapped bandages over the long gash and around the back of her head. Silence reigned over the room for several minutes as no one had anything they could really say. "I knew it. Gato is just going to kill you all." spoke the small boy at the table. Everyone glanced at him, however no one could really dispute the fact under the circumstances. When it went silent again, no one took notice of the almost invisible person walking past the window in the dark of night as their crimson eyes shone with murderous intent. A few hours after Kakashi spoke with them and Yumi had attacked Sakura, Alexis and Heinkel were now standing and preparing to move. We're going into the town to see what we can find on this Gato person. Yumiko, stay here and watch over the master, Heinkel said while strapping her knife to her leg. However, Yumiko said nothing as her head bowed and she didn't move. Yumiko, you hear me? Heinkel asked, now eyeing her friend and sister. She's gone, was the reply. However, it didn't sound like Yumiko. Yumi? Where's Yumiko? Did she fall asleep? Alexis asked, now sounding slightly worried. Yumi shook her head. Not that kind of gone. She's actually gone. She's not there anymore. I can't feel her presence in my mind. I even tried forcing her back but nothing happened. The mental stress and the sadness just washed over whatever wall kept us apart and we merged. I guess I was the stronger personality. Yumi explained. She then looked up and she had Yumiko's glasses on, however the facial features were that of Yumi and the glasses were cracked up into hundreds if not thousands of pieces in the frames. Yumi then continued. Yumiko was always the weak one. It was my job to protect her. Now with her gone, I've got no one to protect. Why did she go away and not me? Yumi started crying. Normally Yumi was just aggressive and angry. But now she was feeling the whole spectrum of emotions that she'd never felt and it was rather overwhelming. Heinkel crouched down and put a hand on her shoulder while Alexis hugged her from behind. That's not true. You have someone to protect. And right now that person needs you more than he ever will. Yumiko knew that and I think that's why she left you behind. So you didn't have to worry about her anymore and you could focus on our master. She knew that you would be stronger than she could ever hope to be and that you could do what she couldn't do alone. Now you need to do what you do best and be strong for Yumiko and do as she wanted. Heinkel explained. Yumi's eyes grew wide and she looked at the blondes before cracking a smile. It was sort of weird to see the smile of Yumiko on Yumi's face, however it wasn't unpleasant. You're right. I need to be strong so our master can get better. Now you two go and find that bastard. I'll hold down the fort, Yumi said with a much calmer and despite the tears, happier look on her face. Soon after, Heinkel and Alexis left the house while again shooting dirty glares at Sakura, who simply shrunk back into her seat. No one asked any questions due to fear of being on receiving end of those glares. The two blondes walked through the streets of Wave with a look of disgust etched on their faces. The place was filthy. People sat on the sidewalks late at night doing all sorts of things while trash lined the streets. Some buildings looked about ready to fall apart while others were already starting to. Fights broke out all over the place over the smallest things, whether it be something like food, money or even just a disagreement. Tensions were high. Eventually they came upon a building that seemed to be in good condition that advertised as a bar. What better place to gather information than a place where people's tongues were loosened by the sweet embrace of alcohol? So as they entered they weren't surprised to instantly be assaulted by the loud sounds of talking as well as the stench of sweat, alcohol, tobacco as well as several other smells they really didn't want to know the origins of. The entire bar was filled with aggressive, vicious-looking men who all seemed to be different from the citizens of Wave. All around women danced, hoping to get the attention and money of the pigs who watched up with lust clear in their eyes. The duo quickly made their way to the bar while trying not to draw attention to themselves. Sitting at the bar stool, Heinkel ordered 2 drinks and started trying to listen into the conversation happening around the bar. But as luck would have it, 2 women of their caliber entering a place like this would garner all kinds of attention from the wrong sort. 2 men approached from behind. Well, what have we here? How would you fine ladies like to come share a drink with us? One of the sleazy patrons asked with more than a little lust in his tone as he eyed the forms of the 2 up and down. Heinkel rolled her eyes behind her blacked-out glasses. No, was her short and clipped response. The grunt seemed to not like that response as his expression grew a little more sour. Come on babe, JSUT, come and talk with us for a while. I'm sure we can become fast friends, he said lecherously as his hand edged toward her shoulder. However, just before contact was made the man cried out in agony as his wrist was grabbed and cracking noise quickly followed. His eyes followed the offending limb to Alexis, who was giving him an absolutely diabolic look over her shoulder. "What part of, no, was that hard to understand exactly?" she asked. The man grew enraged as his wrist was now dislocated and possibly broken. "You bitch, do you know who I am?" he shouted while struggling to free his hand from the increasingly painful grip. Alexis raised an eyebrow. "No, not really," she replied matter-of-factly. This just seemed to aggravate the man further. "I woke for Gato. He'll have your head for this," he then screamed as the grip tightened further. "Oh, you work for Gato? Well, that's good. Any of your friends here work for him?" she asked all too innocently. "Damn straight we do," yelled a patron as every man in the bar except the barkeeper pulled out some kind of weapon. "Good, plenty of chances then. Which means we don't need you." The last part was said to the man in her vice-like grip. The hired thug went to speak only to feel an immense pain that dwarfed that of anything he'd ever experienced. "What the hell?" someone said, getting louder with each word. Everything in the bar stopped as all eyes were on the arm of the man screaming. It looked like dozens of things were slithering around under the skin but never actually breaking the surface. They traveled all the way up his arm to his shoulder, where they disappeared into his vested chest. However, they didn't go for the neck. The whole time the seemingly infested man screamed at the top of his lungs. Then he stopped as the slithering seemed to halt. Not that everything was covered. "You boss has caused a lot of pain and grief to this country. Starvation, pain, poverty, slavery, the list goes on. However, this all pales in comparison to his most grievous of crimes. He has brought pain upon our master. And for this he shall pay. You all shall pay," Alexis said like she was reciting from a Bible. Heinkel downed the last of her drink and turned on her stool. "The gates of hell hath opened. Let me be thy guide." And with that said, the thug still being held by Alexis exploded into a mess of chunks as green vines covered with red thorns tore him apart, and the duo descended upon the room like the hounds of hell themselves. In Konoha, the council had met to discuss what was going on with Team 7. It seems Team 7 has run into trouble during their C-rank mission to Wave Country. They were only supposed to protect a bridge builder from bandits. However, it seems the details were falsified and the rank of the mission has been bumped up to an A- rank. Hiruzen said as the council listened intently. "A medic team has been dispatched under my orders to meet up with the team. One of them sustained serious injuries when they were attacked by one Zabuza Momochi under the orders of Gato Shipping Company. It seems he's taken over the island through its trading routes." Once more Hiruzen stopped and looked around to tell them the floor was open. "What about Lord Uchiha? Is he okay?" a fat merchant called. "Sasuke is fine. He was not the one to fall to injury," Hiruzen said. "What about my daughter?" a pink-haired woman shouted in distress. "Though your daughter is fine, there is a matter we must discuss concerning her," Hiruzen said as the elder Haruno woman became pale. "Naruto Uzumaki Hellsing sustained potentially life-threatening injuries when your daughter Sakura used the boy for a substitution to avoid the blade of the enemy. Naruto found himself suddenly in the path of a poisoned weapon while using a technique that left him immobile. Your daughter has committed a grave offense in this. She will be detained by the medic team I have sent and transported back to Konoha, where she will be charged with assault of an allied ninja of Konoha as well as potential crippling of a ninja of Konoha," he said while the pinkette was nearly in tears. "She's only a child," she screamed. The moment she put on that headband, she threw away her childhood and was recognized as an adult in the eyes of the village. Hiruzen said with fire. "Naruto is no older than her and is now suffering for her actions. She put his life in jeopardy through her own actions. There is no more to say on the matter. The council is dismissed." Hiruzen finished and left the room quickly. "Where the hell were you, Haku?" Zabuza shouted as a dark-haired girl who stood in front of him trying to hold back her tears. "You said not to interfere unless they were about to kill you," she explained. Smack. Zabuza backhanded her and she fell to the floor with her face growing red. "I know what I said. That damn thing was going to get me at that rate, so why didn't you assist me like the good little tool you are?" he continued in his rage, now staring at the girl who had yet to rise from the floor. "I bet you wanted him to get me, huh? So that you could get away. It's not right for a tool to run away. You are to serve me until you break and I no longer have use for you. Then I will discard you on the side of the road where some fool can pick you up and find a use for you," he raged about. Then suddenly the lights all went off. The room felt dark with the only light being the moon coming in through the windows. Zabuza looked around in a frenzy while Haku was focused on 2 points of the room. "What the hell's going on?" Zabuza shouted. "Haku, get over here," he said while dragging the girl from the floor and holding her in front of himself. However, Haku was still staring at that same spot with wide eyes, and Zabuza quickly noticed. "What the hell are you looking at?" he asked, and followed her line of sight only to feel a slight shiver go up his spine. In one of the shadowy corners of the room a pair of crimson orbs seemed to float in the air. "What the hell is that?" Zabuza asked. No response came, and he quickly shoved Haku in the direction of the orbs only for them to seemingly fade away and for Haku to fall into the wall. The ex-Kirin Nin had a bad feeling. He knew where he'd seen those malicious red orbs before, and he watched as they appeared and disappeared over and over again in the shadows on the room. Finally they stopped, and it looked like part of Haku's boy was being actually blocked from view by the darkness. That was when a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth seemed to rip open in the air before moving forwards into the moonlight. Zabuza's eyes widened as the shadow he'd fought earlier that day stood before him. Smoke seemed to drift off its form, and its eyes now looked just like red lights in its skull. "RR Rog!" Zabuza screamed and quickly drew his weapon and swung at the phantasm only to see the large blade pass straight through once again. The shadow grinned widely and held out its hand. More tendrils of smoke quickly coalesced into the form of its black and gray form of Crimson Wing and took a swing as Zabuza and slashed his arm. "Gah!" he grunted as the blade dug a small slash into his bicep. However, he quickly got over the pain and hefted his Kabikirabocho up into a defensive stance. The shadow started hammering away at Zabuza's guard, however this time it seemed to be aiming for the same point of the blade with every hit, and Zabuza picked up on it rather quickly. "He's trying to break the sword," he thought in shock as another strike landed against the thick metal of the blade. Then the part he started to fear began. A small crack started crawling across the blade. It wasn't anything significant, and at this rate it would take quite a few more swings to actually break the blade. But then again, this thing had as long as it wanted. He couldn't hit it back, so it could just keep hammering away till he was left defenseless. But Zabuza's faith in his blade holding out till he could formulate a plan were ill-placed as the shadow suddenly leapt backwards and ran his hand over his own blade. Again the runes appeared and the edge became incandescent before he charged back in ith renewed vigor, and now every time the blades met a small burst of energy would create hairline fractures all along the surface of the Kabikirabocho, as well as cutting small lines into Zabuza's skin. Pretty soon the black wing was almost through the tough metal, and with one final mighty swing cut straight through the blade and took out Zabuza's right arm from the shoulder. The expert swordsman stumbled back with a scream and a curse as H clutched the bloody stump while the shadow watched with violent glee twinkling in its eyes. Deciding to take one last hope to survive, Zabuza moved quickly and grabbed Haku from the ground where she'd been the whole time, watching in wonder as Zabuza seemed doomed against this force of nature that never seemed to cease. Now Zabuza stood with Haku held firmly in front of himself while choking her out as to make sure she was too frantic to get out. The shadow stood across the room for once, a grin nowhere to be seen on its face. It almost looked disappointed. Then time seemed to slow as it lunged forwards with the tip of the sword pointed directly at Haku's heart and by extension Zabuza. The moment the shadow's sword made contact with Haku, it seemingly dissolved into smoke only to reappear on the other side right between Zabuza's chest and Haku's back. The rest soon followed, and this time it pierced Zabuza like it should have Haku, and the man was pushed through the room and stuck to the wall. The shadow's grin returned and it leaned in right next to his ear. "It seems you've met with a terrible fate, haven't you?" it asked in a whispery, hoarse voice. Like the sound of it speaking was unnatural. The light slowly faded from Zabuza's eyes as he died. The shadow then removed its sword from the corpse and the wall before turning around and walking straight past Haku. However, she caught his arm. "Wait!" she almost screamed, and then recoiled as the shadow's crimson eyes now rested solely on her. However, this was her chance to make it up to the person she'd helped hurt. "Take me with you, please," she begged. The shadow just raised an eyebrow at her request. Seeing this as a prompt to plead her case, Haku quickly started speaking. "Zabuza had me by my side not by choice," she said, and moved the hair away from her neck to show a strange-looking seal seemingly burned into the skin. The seal acts as a sort of slavery seal. If I try to do something against his will or if I disobey him it causes immense pain and at will he could trigger the seal to attack my brain and kill me. This got a scowl from the shadow aimed at the dead man. He was a part of Naruto and thus shared rather similar morals when it came to the matter of slavery. However, this didn't explain why he should take her and so he made a continue motion with his hand. Well, Zabuza forced me to make the poison he used on the other you? She said the last part not really sure what to him. I don't have a cure but I can slow the poison down. I assume medics are coming to help if they aren't already there and I can give them time. Please let me repay you for helping me at least. She begged again. The shadow grew thoughtful for a moment. Since it technically had access to all of Naruto's emotions right now it could act on his behalf. A nod was his answer and the girl quickly brightened up. Okay. Wait here, I need to grab some things. She seemed a little too excited about all this in the shadow's opinion. A few moments of Haku running back and forth with a large bag grabbing bits and bobs. She stood before the shadow with a rather large smile plastered on her face. With a shrug from the phantasm the two quickly left with Haku tree hopping behind a large black smoky cloud as it traveled through the forest. 3 hours had passed since the shadow had arrived with Haku at the house. She quickly explained to everyone what happened and they looked to the shadow for confirmation when needed, which came in the form of a nod. Alexis and Heinkel had returned shortly before them. It came as quite a shock to everyone though to see the shadowy version of Naruto moving completely independent of its original. So now Haku was applying a sort of salve to the afflicted area on Naruto's arm. The wound was not looking healthy at all but it was still very much salvageable. At first the dark-haired girl found it difficult to work with Yumi being within arm's reach every time she went near Naruto and not even blinking, however she soon started to ignore the fact. She was given the benefit of the doubt when Naruto started showing signs of the affliction slowing. The veins in his arm and up to his shoulder had been turning black to show the progress of the poison, however now they seemed to not be progressing any further. Alexis noticed something off about the girl the moment she walked in the room, however right now she was the only thing stopping her master from suffering further pain, so until he was safely restored to health the ex-paladin wasn't going to push the fact. You know, Naruto might be able to remove that mark on your neck? Alexis said from her position against the wall as per usual. During her work Haku's hair had moved out of the way giving the tall blonde a good view of the mark. They all picked up on the falter in her working when that was said. Everything was silent for a moment and no one moved. See, could he really? It was barely a whisper. The mark was a horrible reminder of the many years spent with her recently killed owner. Alexis looked to the shadow who hadn't gone back yet. He was acting as a spokesman for Naruto during his absence from the land of the conscious. The monochromatic clone gained a thoughtful look again. It still looked wrong. It then pointed at itself and shook its head as to say, no. And Haku's face fell. She'd truly gotten her hopes up. However, the shadow then pointed at the original and shook his head yes. I thought so. You might not suffer from fatigue like he does, but you can't use a lot of mana, can you? Heinkel asked, having spoken for the first time in a while. Her answer came in the form of the shadow nodding its head in agreement. It'd really only be a matter of building up enough mana to completely overload the seal. It'd fry itself out before it triggered. Alexis said, what do you mean by mana? Haku asked. Mana is basically a much more high-quality version of chakra. It has the same volume as chakra, however is several times denser, meaning you use less to do things. It's also more manipulatable, meaning you're not bound by using jutsu. Instead, mana users use spells which are far less restrictive. Alexis explained. Haku seemed to understand and nodded. Alright, I'm willing to give it a try, she said happily. The medics arrived on time that night and were quick to praise Haku on her ability to slow the poison. They made it very clear that if she hadn't done it they would have been too late. After several hours of intense work the poison was finally flushed from Naruto's system and they finally stitched the wound. Couldn't do it until now due to the poison. Now Naruto just needed to rest and let it naturally heal. Which they noticed was happening pretty quickly. The estimate was that it'd be done in maybe a few days. However, they did make an observation of the fact that the arm seemed to not regain its color. It stayed a pasty white and only after the shoulder did it start to shift into his usual tanner complexion. After Naruto was fixed up the medics made quick work of explaining the situation to Kakashi pertaining to Sakura. The pinkette was horrified at what she heard, and as they dragged her from the home of Tsunami called back to Sasuke in the hopes he would save her. He just looked on apathetically and with a non-committal grunt turned his head. It was at that moment that Sakura started struggling even harder. He's testing me. He wants to see if I can be strong, she thought while trying to cling to the little hope she had. However, the medics quickly grew tired of her and injected her with a strong paralysis. Kakashi sat at the small table across from Sasuke, who seemed indifferent about the whole ordeal. He was thinking about the fact their team would be put on standby until a new member became available. With a heavy sigh, Kakashi got up from the table and started towards the room Naruto was in. Upon knocking on the door, he got a quiet "come in." Once more everyone was in the same places as they always seemed to be, with the addition on Haku on the other side of Yumi. "How's Naruto?" he asked while stepping in and closing the door. "He's doing well now that the poison isn't there anymore. We're expecting him to awaken soon," Haku said. "She seems to be fitting in well with these three," Kakashi thought to himself. He casually noticed that Yumi had her glasses off and yet she seemed stable, almost calm. Groan. "Did anyone get the face of the guy that hit me?" Naruto groaned out as his eyes slowly opened. However, his sight was quickly lost again amongst the breast of Yumi. "Oh, thank Kami you're alive," the nun cried out. Muffled sounds came from Naruto's head before he managed to wriggle his way out of the death grip. He took in large gulps of air. "Can't breath," he said in between breaths. Once regaining his composure and looked around the room as well as the bandages covering his arm that he now noticed hurt to move too much. "How long have I been out?" he asked. 2 or 3 days, he informed from over his porn. Naruto nodded and then became aware of the dark-haired girl on his left side that was watching him very closely. "I think someone should catch me up on what I missed," he said. So the next hour was spent recounting everything that had happened since Naruto went under. He was shocked to hear his shadow had killed Zabuza, but as Haku, as she introduced herself, recounted the fight, Naruto could oddly envision it all from a first-person perspective from his shadow. That would be something to look into later. After hearing about Yumiko departing and leaving Yumi as the sole inhabitant of the body, he was quick to console the woman, who simply thanked him with a smile and a bow. He then turned to Haku. "It would be best if we confronted the easiest task first. So if you could let me see this seal." With that, Haku nodded and turned around before parting her hair to show Naruto the obedience seal. The redhead scowled at the mark and softly placed his injured hand against the seal. "I don't know if this will hurt or not, but if it does I am truly sorry," he said, and started letting the familiar feeling of mana flowing into his hand. He wasn't sure how much he needed, so Naruto started pumping it into the seal, trying not to trigger it. Then when he felt a sort of block when his mana stopped flowing in, he knew it was at its limit, so he gathered up a large dam in his hand and in one quick go pumped it straight into the already full reserve, effectively shattering it. The effects were instantaneous in the form of the burn mark literally melting away like it was done with ink. Naruto wiped it up with his hand. There, one horrible seal made by a dirty, cruel man gone. One ex-slave free to make her own choices and do as she wants, Naruto said with a smile. Haku was nearly in tears. Not because of pain, as it was a truly painless process. It was because the last thing connecting her to that horrible life had been literally wiped away by this person she hardly knew. However, it was there, and then she made her decision. She knew what she wanted to do. So now it's time for the big question. "What is it you want to do, Haku?" he asked, genuinely curious. He was stunned when the girl turned to him teary-eyed with a smile and bowed low. "I have spoken with Alexis, Heinkel and Yumi, and they've agreed to take me into Iscariot so long as I gain your blessing," she said. Naruto wasn't sure what to say. He looked to the 3 women and received nods, saying what Haku said was true. He then looked back to the girl with her head pressed to the floor. He placed a hand on her shoulders and pulled her up to look at him. "Well, who am I to say what you can and can't do?" he said. Haku's face lit up and she pounced at him, knocking him over, gripping him rather tightly. He would have let her stay there if not for the fact she had his injured arm included in the constriction. So as is customary when one is put in a position of pain they can't escape from, he let out his agony in a scream. Have you ever woken up and felt like way more time passed than what actually did? Like you'd been asleep for years when it only felt like a few measly hours? That's how Naruto felt as he woke up in his usual fashion, covered in a cold sweat and mid-panic attack. Man, And here I thought that was stopping. Thought the young magus solemnly as he calmed his racing heart. Well, at least we would get the chance to get some fresh air today. Heinkel, Alexis and Yumi had all decided they needed to go take a better look around the island, and Kakashi was taking Sasuke to the bridge, which left himself, Haku, Tsunami and Inari at the house. So it was with some slight strain from his tense body that Naruto got up and dressed himself. It was a lot harder than one might think due to his bandage-covered arm. The appendage itself being wrapped from the second knuckles of his fingers up to his shoulder and torso. A wince flashed across his face as he tried to lift the arm into the ruined sleeve of his coat before giving up and just leaving the mostly open coat as a makeshift sling. Still tender, Naruto muttered when he glanced at the limb. He'd seen the damage the attack had caused, and while it was healing nicely, there was no doubt about the ugly scar that was going to be left in its place. But it was better than the open, festering wound it had been 2 days ago when Haku had changed the bandages. With a one-shoulder shrug, Naruto exited the room he was staying in and walked down the hall to the kitchen, dining room area that served as the main room of the house. Inari was up in his room and Tsunami stood in the kitchen boiling some tea. "Ah, Naruto, is it okay for you to be up and about like this?" the woman asked with surprise then concern as she glanced at the limp hand hanging from his open coat. Naruto for his part just gave the worried woman a smile. "Yeah, it's still tender but it's healing up fine. Say, do you have any idea where Haku is?" he replied with his tone turning towards confusion after not noticing the ice user anywhere nearby. "Oh, she said something about needing to restock some of the more delicate herbs she uses in her medicine." The daughter of the bridge builder replied. Naruto simply gave a nod to that. "Well, I'm just going to be outside for some fresh air. I'll make sure not to stray too far from the house," he said with a dismissive wave at her impending protest. It seemed to set her mind at ease somewhat, and Naruto simply wandered out the door before inhaling deeply. "Huh, that's nice." The air inside was going stale. He spoke to no one in particular. It was then with a slight bit of effort that the once blonde found his way up to the roof of the house. Settling into a nice position laying on its slanted roof, he simply stared at the sky and the passing clouds for a while before removing his ever-present copy of Loveless. Naruto'd probably read it cover to cover more times than any person would really need to, and when he got back to the Hellsing Manor he'd need to find some new reading material, but for now it'd serve his purpose, and so for the next half hour or so he simply rested on the roof in the cool, salty air of wave and read the same lines he'd read over and over. Occasionally willing his magic through his arm to see if there was any problem of that front. Thankfully not. So it was almost an hour later that Naruto picked up on sounds coming from the opposite side of the house. Stashing his reading material and summoning Crimson Wayne, the young magus crawled carefully over the tiles on the roof and peeked over to see what the sounds were. "So what are we here for again, Zori?" asked the taller of the two figures. A large burly man with an eye patch and a bared chest that just screamed, "Yakuza." "I already told Waraji. The boss wants the girl and her kid for leverage," came the reply of when Naruto assumed was Zori. The man looked a lot younger and had a delinquent appearance to him. However, the only real thing they both shared that Naruto took note of were the katana strapped to both their waists. That was all Naruto needed to know. These two were trouble. So with more grace than one would expect, he leapt from the roof and landed in front of the two. "Huh? Who the hell are you, kid?" asked Waraji. No response came from Naruto. "Wait, the arm. Isn't that the kid Zabuza crippled before he up and outed?" Zori pointed out. It was then Waraji let out boisterous laughter. "They left a crippled kid to protect the builder's daughter. Oh, that's hilarious," he roared before quickly unsheathing his blade to stop the sheath that had been launched at him. "Hey kid, that's not funny. You could hurt." He was cut off by the flash of the sheath being dispelled. "Damn it," he shouted as he rubbed at his one eye. Zori on the other hand had been far enough away and wary enough of the kid that he'd seen the sheath and looked at the kid in the flash, which had saved his life as he barely blocked the blood-colored blade swinging for his neck. "Kid's tricky and fast," he sneered before swinging back, causing Naruto to have OT back up. Waraji finally rubbed the spots out of his eyes and glared at Naruto menacingly. "I was gonna leave you alone, kid, but now I'm mad. Zori, let's thrash the brat," he shouted before rushing in with all the grace of a stampeding rhino. "Don't have to tell me twice." Zori grinned maliciously before shadowing his larger in. The two rogue samurai were surprisingly good when attacking in tandem. Waraji's style was wild, explosive and heavy while Zori was precise, controlled and quick. It seemed Waraji was supposed to distract the enemy while Zori took them down. So for Naruto, who was a one-handed swordsman, there was no chance he could block Waraji's attacks. He ended up blocking the lighter but quicker hits of the beanie-wearing Zori and dodging the larger attacks of the bare-chested Waraji. "Hey, kid's got some fight in him," came the gruff Mon's shout. He seemed to almost be enjoying this. "Come on, just hold him still already. We need to finish up here before the attack at the bridge starts," Zori demanded of his partner. That last part caught Naruto's attention. Attack on the bridge? Damn, I need to stop playing with these two, he thought, and with that his whole demeanor shifted. No longer did Naruto seem to be on the back foot. He shirked off his coat to let his bandaged arm out, and a sense of seriousness seemed to fall over the clearing. "I wish I could play around with you two more. But now I have a reason to kill you. So drop dead," his voice so cold it could freeze fire. The two were surprised by the sudden change in attitude, and were even more so when the brat appeared in front of Waraji, low and inside his guard with a palm on his stomach. "Get blown away." And with that shout, a fireball quickly spawned in his hand and erupted outwards, sending the once samurai, now cadaver, ragdolling across the clearing with a meaty hole in its stomach. Another second and Naruto's blade made contact with the beanie-wearing thug's temple, cleaving through his eyes and out the other side. "Haku," Naruto called out into the forest, having a feeling the older girl was watching, and his hunch proved right as she appeared in a swirl of water. "Haku, I'm heading to the bridge to help out. Take care of Tazuna's daughter and his grandson," he subconsciously ordered, and without even needing to see the nod or hear the "yes master," he took off like a bat out of hell. The sight Naruto came upon was of the bridge being swarmed from the far shore by bandits, thugs, vagabond and cut purse. Hired muscle of all shapes, sizes and colors, wielding weapons even more diverse than their wielders. Normally this wouldn't be a problem for a ninja of Kakashi's level, but with having to watch out for the builders and the Uchiha who looked worse for wear. Well, you get the idea. It was with these observations that Naruto rushed along the bridge to help out. "Naruto? What are you doing here?" Kakashi asked as he noticed the distinctive crimson of his orb pupil twirling and whipping about their enemies, trying to take some of the stress off of Sasuke, who had been having a hard time of it. A pair of goons showed at Tazuna's looking to make off with Tsunami. "When they mentioned an attack on the bridge, I left Haku to take care of the house and came as soon as possible." The genin shouted over the sounds of battle towards his teacher. That seemed to satisfy Kakashi as they went quiet again and focused on making sure none of the seemingly endless waves of thugs got through to the builders who behind them, most of which seemed to have been injured in one way or another. "Where the hell are the three that normally hang off your tail, loser? At least they'd be able to actually do something," Sasuke snarled at his teammate. Needless to say, that comment wasn't well received. "Drop dead, Sasuke. They'll be here when they can," Naruto roared back as he continued to slash and hack at the wall of bandits. These guys were literally trampling their fallen comrades. Gato must have thrown some serious money around to cause this kind of fervor. Naruto quickly skipped back and ran a hand down the blade of Crimson Wing, igniting the runes along the flat of the blade and infusing it with his mana. Just as quickly as before, he ran back in and continued the massacre, his magically infused blade now cleaving flesh and bone like butter. Kra boom. The entire bridge shook as something seemed to impact against one of the bridge's supports. A quick glance made it apparent. A large boat sat in the water a ways away from the bridge itself, and a large cannon seemed to make up the frontal portion of the vessel, and upon even closer inspection Naruto caught sight of a diminutive man standing in a pin-strip suit wearing a self-satisfied grin as he watched the crew scurry around to load the cannon. Naruto knew who this was on instinct. The cause of the problem. His arm throbbed as he looked at this man and his vision flashed red. "Gato!" he howled as he lashed out at the nearest bandit, bisecting him from shoulder to hip. "Kakashi, Gato's here. He's got a cannon on a ship in the water. He's trying to take out the supports." Naruto relayed to Kakashi, who was further from the edge, being in the center of the bridge and taking the brunt of the bandits. "Damn, we need to take that cannon out of this whole bridge is coming down. I can't use any of my more powerful jutsu without putting the builders at risk," Kakashi replied. This situation was going from worse to shit. How the hell are we going to get someone over there? It'll have to be me or Sasuke. Naruto decided. Kakashi was too integral to the defense of the builders. A way over, you say? What do you reckon, Heinkel? 300 to 400 meters? Came the accented voice of Alexis, who was cheery-faced as usual. 543.21 meters. Replied the other blonde of Iscariot. Alright, I can do it easy. Yumi, take over for the master. Heinkel, take over for the brat. He looks about ready to pass out. Master, come here, I got your ticket onto that boat. She announced with cheer before hunching down and locking her hands together in a foothold. Naruto knew where this was going and grinned. Alright, here we go, he shouted before getting a run up and leaping, landing both feet in Alexis' hands before the tall ex-holy woman heaved her master with all of her considerable strength. This must be what it's like to be a bird. Naruto though absently as he sailed through the air. That is until he reached the apex of his flight and started the rapid plummet. Idly he noticed that he would land almost directly in front of where Gato once stood and was now retreating from. It was with a thunderous crack and the splintering of the admittedly sturdy deck that Naruto landed, having pumped a considerable amount of mana into his lower body to not smear himself on the deck. The impact itself managed to rock the boat enough to cause some of the crew to stumble before finding their legs again and charging the boarding party with weapon drawn. One thing Naruto immediately took advantage of was the fact that on the bridge he couldn't really use his destructive fireballs for fear of damaging the bridge. On the boat that wasn't a problem. So it was in a wicked dance of blade and bomb that Naruto all but danced about the deck, killing the crew and blowing up anything that looked useful. It felt like an eternity to the ecstatic redhead, but in reality was mere minutes before the crew had been reduced to Gato and two of his thugs. Now Naruto stood, only two people between him and the little bastard. Well, here we are, the final confrontation. Is there where you reveal your secret weapon? Naruto asked as his grin grew. He was having too much fun. Kill this brat. Kill him and I'll make you rich beyond your wildest dreams. The vertically challenged tyrant shouted at the two flunkies who remained. The promise of riches like that seemed to take their sensibility out of the action as they charged the Crimson Man before them. It was two simple sword swipes that saw them join the rest of their brethren on the floor. It was at this point that Gato fell back and started crawling backwards. He was clearly afraid. Is this really it? Naruto asked as he looked down upon this supposed monster. You're nothing. No strength of your own. He answered himself as he stalked towards the cowering man. I don't even know if I could play a game with you. You're already so afraid. With that, Naruto looked around the deck. Huh. Ah well, nothing I can do, I guess. He muttered before dispelling Crimson Wing and wandering off in the direction he was looking. Why, you're gonna let me live? Just like that? Gato asked with hope in his voice. Naruto for his part looked back at the man once he'd gotten where he wanted. What the hell are you talking about? He said as he reached down and grabbed the coil of rope on the deck. I'm just making sure the captain goes down with the ship. He purred maliciously while he pulled a section of rope taut and cackled in glee as Gato seemed to go through all new kinds of fear. Please, don't do this. I'll give you money, women, power, anything, he screamed as Naruto dragged him by the collar of the tacky suit he wore. I only wanted the bridge builder. I didn't mean for you to get involved. Naruto was now tying him to the cannon that was mounted to the deck. I bet you didn't mean a lot of things you've said or done. I bet you don't even mean what you're saying now. He was enjoying this way too much. But in the end, words can only mean so much. Naruto gave the man a mocking smack on the shoulder. It's your actions that really define who you are, he said with a salute before walking up to the edge of the boat and throwing a fireball in the general direction of a pile of gunpowder barrels on the deck. Toodle-loo, he finished with a mocking wave and fell backwards over the deck to the waters below. With the assistance of Heinkel, Yumi and Alexis, the bandits were a lot easier to fight. Heinkel using her dual trench knives to slash throats and cut arteries. It was like a terrifying dance. One that twisted and turned as the lit cigarette in her mouth left a luminescent trail. Yumi would simply swipe her own blade and easily cleave through two, sometimes three different people, often cutting the same targets multiple times to leave them as mere chunks on the floor. Alexis was constantly swapping between throwing entire fistfuls of bayonets at a time and dual-wielding the unorthodox blades to cut a swath of carnage through the mob. uncaring of any damage inflicted on her, as the tendrils that made up her musculature would come to life as thorny vines and shred people to ribbons before reforming and healing. Eventually Kakashi thought it would be better for him to simply step back. He needed to keep an eye on Sasuke, who was downed anyway. So it was this dance of death and gore that ended the seemingly endless legion of bandits that was now barely a trickle. The last few making a futile attempt to run, only to receive a bayonet to the back of the skull for their effort. Moments passed between the final bandit falling and the boat that sat out in the water's rear going up in a great fireball. The builders stood transfixed by the flames that danced on the boat as the ship slowly sunk into the admittedly deep channel the bridge spanned. None were sure how long they stood there, but it was the sound of wet footfalls that alerted all of them to the approach of a thoroughly drenched Naruto. Even Naruto was hypnotized by the sinking vessel, as he too wouldn't take his eyes off the sight while he walked along the cobbles of the bridge. When the redhead was finally in range of the group, he let out a satisfied sound. "Huh, that was really cathartic. I needed to achu." The statement being ended with a rather loud sneeze. "So maybe jumping off the boat wasn't my best idea?" he said with a sheepish rub of the back of his head. Alexis finally let out the laughter she'd been holding in. Heinkel could only shake her head and grin at her master showing his age, and Yumi quickly hurried over to him, acting more like Yumiko did, and tried to warm the boy as he shivered in the cold air. Kakashi could only smile as the son of his teacher was doted upon by the nun, as he laughed along with Alexis and now even a slightly chuckling Heinkel. Sasuke was out cold on the bridge. He dropped moment after Naruto was launched due to exhaustion. "Well, I think we should all head back for today. Let the wounded heal and all that," Tazuna declared. So it was with the orders of a bridge builder that the group assisted the injured builders back to the town proper. That night there was celebration in Wave. Gato's estate was quickly raided by the people for all it was worth and was left a husk, though some did note that objects seemed to be missing already. They assumed that it must have been remnants of Gato's thugs taking what they could.
That's all for now. If you want to see next part, then please like this video and subscribe my channel. Thank you.